Hi there. May these ancient Buddhist teachings carry you into the most peaceful sleep you have experienced in a very long time. I'm sharing with you tonight 25 profound stories, each one a gentle doorway into wisdom, so deep, so transformative, that millions have found not just rest, but genuine healing in their message. These are not merely tales to pass the time, but sacred teachings wrapped in narrative, keys that unlock the natural peace your body and mind have been longing to remember. You have found your way here tonight because something within you recognizes that true rest is possible, that peace is not just a distant dream, but your birthright, that this night can be different from all the restless nights that came before. And you are absolutely right. Tonight will be different. These 25 Buddhist stories will guide you like gentle lanterns through the darkness, each teaching a profound truth, each word an invitation to release everything you have been carrying. Before we begin this sacred journey together, if you feel moved to share where in the world you are listening from tonight, I would be honored to know. Are you resting in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, somewhere else on this beautiful earth? There is something profoundly comforting about knowing we are all here together, seekers from every corner of the world, breathing the same intention for deep, restorative rest. Welcome to Sleepy Zen. This is your sanctuary, a space where nothing is demanded of you, where you are invited to release every burden you carry, where gentleness is the only practice. If this resonates with the quiet place within you that simply wants to rest, to be held, to finally let go, I invite you to subscribe so you can return here whenever sleep feels difficult, whenever peace seems far away, whenever you need these teachings. For now, just breathe. Let your body settle a little deeper into whatever is supporting you. Let your eyes remain closed if they are not already. We are going to walk together through 25 stories, so gentle, so filled with wisdom, that they will carry you like a leaf on a quiet stream, drifting naturally, effortlessly toward the vast ocean of deep, healing sleep. Our first story takes us to a monastery nestled in mountains so remote that clouds would settle in the valleys like rivers of mist, and the silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. Here lived a young monk named Ren, who had been practicing meditation with desperate intensity for 7 years, seeking enlightenment the way a drowning person seeks air. Ren would wake before dawn and meditate until his legs ached beyond bearing. He would study sutras until his eyes burned with exhaustion. He would practice walking meditation until his feet bled. He gave everything he had, every ounce of effort, every moment of every day, consumed by the burning question that tormented him through sleepless nights. Am I getting closer to enlightenment? Am I doing enough? Will I ever achieve what I came here to find? The harder Ren tried, the more enlightenment seemed to elude him. He would sit in meditation and his mind would wander. He would read about emptiness and feel nothing but confusion. He would hear other monks speak of their insights and feel crushing inadequacy. 7 years of relentless effort, and he felt further from peace than the day he had arrived. One autumn morning, after another sleepless night spent tormenting himself with questions about his progress, Ren was walking through the monastery garden when he came upon the abbot, a very old monk named Dogen, who was simply sitting on a stone bench beneath a ginkgo tree, watching leaves fall with such complete presence that the air around him seemed to shimmer with stillness. Ren stood watching for a long time, and finally Dogen opened his eyes and smiled, gesturing for Ren to sit beside him. They sat together in silence, and Ren felt his desperation building like pressure in a sealed vessel, finally erupting in words that tumbled out raw and unguarded. Master Dogen, I cannot continue like this. I have practiced for 7 years with complete dedication. I meditate for hours every day. I study constantly. I follow every teaching perfectly, but I feel no closer to enlightenment than when I began. In fact, I feel more lost, more confused, more desperate. What am I doing wrong? Why can everyone else seem to make progress while I remain stuck? Please, tell me what I am missing. Dogen sat in silence for so long that Ren wondered if he had even heard the question. Finally, the old monk pointed to a ginkgo leaf that was falling from the tree above them, drifting down in lazy spirals. catching the morning light. "Tell me," Dogen said softly, "is that leaf trying to fall?" Ren watched the leaf complete its gentle descent and land on the moss at their feet. "No, Master. It is just falling naturally." "Is it worried about falling correctly? Is it comparing itself to other leaves? Is it measuring its progress toward the ground?" "No," Ren said, beginning to sense where this was leading. "And yet," Dogen continued, his voice like water flowing over smooth stones, "it falls perfectly. It lands exactly where it needs to land, not because it tries, but because it allows. It surrenders to gravity, to the wind, to the natural forces that move through it. This is the nature of all things when we stop interfering." He turned to look at Ren fully, his ancient eyes holding such compassion that Ren felt tears beginning to form. "You are like someone trying to force a leaf to fall in a particular way. You are trying to make enlightenment happen through sheer effort, through relentless striving, through desperate seeking. But enlightenment is not something you achieve through trying. It is what remains when you stop trying, when you surrender, when you allow yourself to fall naturally, like this leaf." Dogen picked up the leaf that had just fallen and held it gently on his palm. "For 7 years you have been at war with yourself, demanding that you be different, better, more enlightened, but this war is itself the obstacle. The seeking is the barrier. Every moment you spend trying to become enlightened is a moment you are not present to the enlightenment that is already here, already available, already what you are." Ren felt something beginning to crack inside him, like ice meeting warm water. "But Master, if I stop trying, if I stop seeking, won't I just become lazy? Won't I fail to make progress? Isn't effort necessary?" Dogen smiled gently. "There is a difference between natural effort and forced striving. A river flows to the ocean with great power, moving rocks, carving canyons, unstoppable in its movement. But the river is not trying. It is simply being what it is, following its nature. This is natural effort, powerful, effective, but without strain, without struggle, without the violence you have been doing to yourself." He let the leaf drift from his palm back to the ground. "When you practice from this natural place, from allowing rather than forcing, from presence rather than seeking, the practice becomes effortless, not without energy, not without engagement, but without the exhausting strain of trying to be something you are not, trying to get somewhere you are not, trying to achieve something that is already here." That day marked a profound turning point in Ren's practice. He did not stop meditating, did not abandon his practice, did not become lazy or undisciplined, but everything changed in how he approached it. When he sat in meditation, he stopped trying to achieve some special state. He simply sat, allowing whatever arose to arise, allowing whatever passed to pass. Like leaves falling naturally from a tree, when he walked, he stopped measuring his spiritual progress with each step. He simply walked, feeling his feet on the earth, feeling the movement of his body, present to the simple act of walking. When he studied, he stopped demanding that understanding come immediately. He simply read, allowing the teachings to work on him in their own time, in their own way, and something remarkable happened. The desperation that had consumed him for 7 years began to dissolve like mist in morning sunlight, not because he achieved something new, but because he stopped creating suffering through his relentless seeking. The peace he had been grasping for revealed itself to have been here all along, waiting beneath the storm of his striving, as close as his own breath. He discovered that enlightenment was not a destination to reach, but a way of being present to what is already here. Not later, not elsewhere, not in some future moment when he finally got it right. Here, now, this breath, this step, this simple, ordinary, extraordinary moment of being alive and aware. Months after that conversation beneath the ginkgo tree, Ren was sitting in meditation when he experienced something he had never felt in all his years of desperate seeking. He was so completely present to the simple act of breathing that there was no sense of someone trying to meditate. There was just breathing, just awareness, just this. And in that moment of complete surrender, he understood what Dogen had been pointing to. He had not become enlightened. He had simply recognized the enlightenment that had always been present, like suddenly seeing glasses that had been on his face all along. When the meditation period ended and he opened his eyes, he found Dogen standing nearby, and somehow, without words, the old master knew. "You stopped trying," Dogen said simply, his eyes shining with joy. "I stopped trying," Ren confirmed, his voice thick with gratitude and wonder. "And in stopping, I found what I had been seeking all along. Or rather, I recognized it had never been lost." Dogen nodded. "Now your real practice begins. Not the practice of seeking enlightenment, but the practice of living from enlightenment, of remembering again and again to simply be present, to allow rather than force, to fall like leaves fall naturally, effortlessly, perfectly. As you rest here now, breathing softly in the darkness, can you practice what Ren learned? Can you stop trying to rest correctly? Stop seeking the perfect state of peace. Stop forcing yourself to fall asleep. Can you simply allow, simply surrender, simply be like a leaf falling, trusting that you will land exactly where you need to land, not through effort, but through allowing? Our second story takes us to a coastal village where the rhythm of waves was the heartbeat of daily life, where fishermen knew the ocean's moods as intimately as their own, where the salt air carried both sustenance and stories. Here lived a woman named Hannah, who owned a small tea house that had been in her family for 3 generations. Hannah's tea house was beautiful, meticulously maintained, with every detail carefully attended to. The garden was immaculate, every stone in its perfect place, every plant precisely trimmed. The tea room was spotless, every cup aligned exactly, every scroll hung at the precise angle. Hannah took enormous pride in this perfection, and visitors would often comment on the exquisite care evident in every corner. But Hannah could not rest. Every night, she would lie awake, her mind racing through endless lists of what needed to be done tomorrow, what might go wrong, what was not quite perfect yet. A crack had appeared in one of the teacups, she needed to replace it. A branch in the garden was growing at an odd angle, she needed to trim it. A guest had left a thumbprint on the shoji screen, she needed to clean it. The pursuit of perfection that made her tea house so admired was the same thing that kept her from sleep, from peace, from any sense that her work was ever complete. There was always something more to fix, to improve, to perfect. The harder she worked to make everything flawless, the more exhausted she became, and the more her body and spirit longed for rest that never came. One day, a Buddhist nun named Sayo came to the village and stopped at Hannah's tea house. Sayo was very old, her robes faded and patched, her few possessions carried in a simple cloth bundle. But she had a quality of ease about her that was immediately apparent, a sense of being completely at peace with exactly what was. Hannah served Sayo tea in her finest cup, placing it precisely on the table with the handle at the exact correct angle. But as Sayo lifted the cup to drink, she accidentally bumped it against the table, creating a tiny chip on the rim. Hannah felt her heart sink, felt frustration rising like bile. That cup was part of a precious set, and now it was ruined, imperfect, damaged. But Sayo simply smiled as she noticed the chip, running her finger gently over the small imperfection. "Ah," she said softly, "now this cup has a story. Now it is not just another perfect cup among thousands of perfect cups. Now it is unique, marked by this moment, by this meeting between us." She looked at Hannah with eyes that seemed to see everything. "I can feel your distress about this chip. You believe I have ruined something valuable, but consider, was the cup more valuable when it was perfect and identical to every other cup? Or is it more valuable now that it carries the mark of our encounter, now that it has become irreplaceable?" Hannah wanted to argue, wanted to explain that yes, obviously the cup was more valuable when it was perfect, when it was flawless, when it matched the others in the set. But something in Sayo's gentle gaze stopped her, invited her to truly consider the question rather than react from her habitual belief about perfection. "In Japan," Sayo continued, settling more comfortably into her seat, "there is an ancient art called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with lacquer mixed with gold. The cracks and breaks are not hidden but highlighted, celebrated, seen as part of the object's history, adding to its beauty rather than diminishing it. The philosophy behind this practice is profound. The broken places, the imperfections, the damage, These do not make something less valuable. They make it more real, more honest, more beautiful, because they tell the truth about existence, that everything breaks, everything changes, everything is imperfect, and this imperfection is not a flaw, but the nature of being alive. Sayo sipped her tea from the now chipped cup. You have created such perfection here, Hana. Everything is flawless, controlled, exactly as it should be. But I wonder, at what cost? What have you sacrificed in your pursuit of this perfection? What does it cost you to maintain this flawlessness? Hana felt tears beginning to form. The cost had been enormous. She never rested, never felt satisfied, never allowed herself to simply be because there was always something that needed to be more perfect. She had lost the ability to enjoy her own tea house because she was constantly monitoring it for flaws, constantly anxious about what might go wrong, constantly exhausted from the effort of maintaining impossible standards. I cannot sleep, Hana admitted quietly, the words coming out before she could stop them. I lie awake every night thinking about everything that is not quite right, everything that needs to be fixed. I am so tired, but I cannot rest because nothing is ever perfect enough. Sayo nodded with deep understanding. This is the suffering that comes from demanding that life be perfect, from believing that you can control everything, from refusing to accept that imperfection, impermanence, and change are the fundamental nature of existence. You are fighting against reality itself, and it is a battle you can never win. The cup will chip. The garden will grow wild if left untended. Guests will leave fingerprints. This is not failure. This is life. She placed her hand gently on Hana's. The Buddha taught that all suffering comes from tanha, craving, grasping, the desire for things to be different than they are. You are suffering not because your tea house is imperfect, but because you crave perfection, because you grasp at control, because you refuse to accept the natural flow of things. This craving is what keeps you awake, what steals your peace, what makes even your beautiful accomplishments feel empty. Sayo stood and walked to the window, looking out at the carefully manicured garden. What if you allowed one corner of this garden to grow wild? What if you let moss cover some of the stones? What if you use this chipped cup as your favorite, as a reminder that beauty includes imperfection, that value is not diminished by flaws? She turned back to Hana. What if you practiced wabi-sabi, the acceptance of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness as not just inevitable, but beautiful? What if you saw the thumbprint on the screen not as something to immediately erase, but as evidence that someone was here, that life is happening, that your tea house is being lived in rather than preserved like a museum? Over the following weeks, Hana began a practice that felt both terrifying and liberating. She kept the chipped cup and began using it for her own tea, feeling the small imperfection under her thumb as she drank, learning to see it not as damage but as character, not as flaw but as story. She allowed one corner of the garden to grow more freely, letting wildflowers emerge between the carefully placed stones, letting moss spread naturally on the garden path. At first it felt wrong, like she was failing, like she was letting standards slip, but gradually she began to see the beauty in the untamed corner, the way it contrasted with the carefully maintained areas, the way it breathed life and spontaneity into the controlled perfection. She stopped immediately cleaning every fingerprint, every small mark left by visitors. She let the tea house show signs of being used, being lived in, being real rather than perfect. And something remarkable happened as she practiced this acceptance of imperfection. The constant anxiety that had hummed beneath every moment began to quiet. The relentless mental list of what needed to be fixed began to shorten. She found herself actually enjoying her tea house again, actually taking pleasure in serving guests rather than monitoring them for potential damage they might cause. And sleep began to come. Not every night perfectly, not without any thoughts or worries, but more often, more deeply, more restoratively. She could lie down at night, and instead of cataloging imperfections, she could feel gratitude for the day, for the guests who had come, for the tea that had been shared, for the life that was happening in this space she had created. One evening, several months after Sayo's visit, Hana was preparing to close the tea house when she noticed a new crack forming in one of her favorite tea bowls. The old Hana would have felt despair. would have stayed awake all night, grieving the loss of perfection. But this Hana simply ran her finger along the crack and smiled, thinking about how she might repair it with gold lacquer, how the crack might become the most beautiful thing about the bowl, how imperfection was becoming her teacher. That night, she slept deeply, dreaming of golden cracks spreading through perfect surfaces, of moss growing on stone paths, of gardens that were wild and tended at once, of a life that was beautifully, perfectly imperfect. As you rest here now, can you practice what Hannah learned? Can you let go of demanding perfection from this moment, from your rest, from yourself? Can you accept the cracks and chips and imperfections as part of your story, as evidence of a life being lived, as beautiful in their honesty? You do not need to be perfect to deserve rest. You can sleep now, exactly as you are, imperfect and whole. Our third story takes us deep into the mountains, where winter comes early and stays late, where snow falls in silence, so complete it seems the world is holding its breath, where a small temple stood that had housed Buddhist monks for over 300 years. Here lived a monk named Koji, who had been carrying a terrible burden for most of his adult life. 15 years earlier, before Koji had come to the monastery, he had been a businessman in a large city. In pursuit of success and wealth, he had made decisions that had harmed people. He had been dishonest in ways that still made him feel sick when he remembered. He had prioritized profit over people, had betrayed trust, had caused suffering to those who had believed in him. Eventually, the weight of what he had done became unbearable. He had left his business life, given away what money remained, and come to this remote mountain monastery seeking redemption, seeking to somehow make amends for the harm he had caused, seeking to become a person worthy of forgiveness. But 15 years of dedicated practice had not eased the guilt. If anything, it had grown heavier with time. Every night when Koji lay down to sleep, the memories would come like unwelcome visitors, vivid and accusing. He would see the faces of people he had hurt, hear the words he wished he had never spoken, feel again the shame of who he had been before finding this path. The guilt was relentless. It whispered to him that he was unworthy of peace, that he deserved to suffer, that no amount of meditation or study or moral living could ever wash away the stains of his past actions. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was restless, filled with dreams that were more like nightmares of accusation and judgment. Koji's teacher was the abbot of the temple, a nun named Aishin, who had practiced for over 60 years and who carried a quality of profound compassion that seemed to embrace everything without judgment. She had watched Koji struggling with his burden for years, had listened to his confessions countless times, had seen how his inability to forgive himself was slowly destroying him from within. One winter morning, after another sleepless night had left Koji hollow-eyed and exhausted, Aishin asked him to accompany her on a walk through the snow-covered temple grounds. They walked in silence until they reached a small frozen pond that lay in the garden, its surface a perfect mirror of ice, reflecting the grey winter sky. "Stand here and watch," Aishin said gently. Then she picked up a large stone and threw it hard onto the frozen surface. The stone hit with a sharp crack, and immediately fractures spread across the ice, radiating outward in intricate patterns, disturbing the perfect reflection, creating a web of breaks and disruption. They stood together, watching, and gradually, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the water beneath the ice began to work on the cracks. The fractures filled with water that then refroze, smoothing some of the disruption. Snow began to fall softly, covering the broken surface, obscuring the damage. "The stone is your past actions," Aishin said quietly, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "They happened. They were real. They caused disruption, created damage, spread consequences outward in ways you could not control. The impact was real, Koji. I am not telling you it was not real or that it did not matter." She pointed to the ice. "But look, the pond does not hold onto the impact forever. Nature begins immediately to heal, to fill in the cracks, to smooth the surface, to cover the damage with new snow. The stone remains at the bottom. The action happened, and that is a fact. But the pond does not keep replaying the moment of impact. It does not keep the cracks fresh and open through constant remembering. It moves forward. It heals. It allows new snow to fall and cover what was broken. Eishin turned to look at Koji with eyes that held infinite compassion. But you, Koji, you are like someone who keeps throwing the same stone onto the ice again and again through memory, through rumination, through your refusal to let the past be past. The original actions happened 15 years ago. The people involved have moved on with their lives. The circumstances have completely changed. Everything has transformed except your grip on guilt, except your insistence on replaying the impact over and over, keeping the cracks fresh, refusing to let healing happen. Koji felt something breaking open inside him, like ice cracking. But Eishin-sama, if I let go of the guilt, if I forgive myself, does that not mean I am saying what I did was acceptable? Does that not dishonor the people I hurt? Eishin shook her head slowly. Holding on to guilt does not help anyone. It does not undo what was done. It does not heal those who were hurt. It only ensures that there is one more person suffering in the world. The people you harmed have every right to their own feelings, their own process of healing or not healing. But your self-hatred does not serve them. Your sleepless nights do not make their pain less. Your endless punishment of yourself does not change what happened. She reached out and took both of Koji's hands in hers. True responsibility for past harm is not self-hatred. It is honest acknowledgement of what happened which you have done. It is genuine remorse for the suffering caused which you clearly feel. It is making amends where possible and where it would be helpful rather than harmful, which you cannot do, as you have no contact with those people. And most importantly, it is transforming yourself, so you do not repeat the patterns that led to harm, which you have done through 15 years of dedicated practice. Eishin's voice became even gentler. You have become a completely different person, Koji. Every cell in your body has been replaced multiple times since those actions. Your understanding has deepened immeasurably. Your capacity for compassion has grown beyond recognition. You are literally not the same person who did those things. That person was doing the best they could with the understanding they had, acting from confusion and greed and suffering. But that person no longer exists. She paused, letting this truth settle like the falling snow. What you are doing now is identifying with that past person, taking on their guilt as if it were happening now, as if you are still that person making those choices, but you are not. The ice has healed, new snow has fallen. Only your thinking keeps throwing stones, creating new cracks where none need to exist. Over the following months, Koji practiced what Eishin had taught him. When the memories of his past actions arose, which they still did regularly, he practiced a new way of meeting them. He would acknowledge them honestly. Yes, this happened. Yes, I caused harm. Yes, I feel genuine remorse. But then, instead of spiraling into the familiar pattern of endless self-punishment, he would practice letting the ice heal. He would feel the guilt as a sensation in his body, the tightness in his chest, the heaviness in his stomach, the shame that wanted to consume him without adding the story about what it meant about his fundamental worthiness. He would acknowledge the remorse without making it into a life sentence. He would remember that the person who did those things was suffering and confused, and that he had transformed completely since then, slowly, gradually, like ice healing after impact, like snow covering broken surfaces. The grip of guilt began to loosen. The memories still came, but they no longer destroyed him. He could remember without being consumed. He could feel remorse without drowning in shame. He could acknowledge his past without being imprisoned by it. And as the guilt loosened its hold, something he had not felt in 15 years began to emerge. Sleep. Real sleep. Not every night perfectly, not without any difficult moments, but more often, more deeply, more restoratively. When he lay down to rest, he could practice what Eishin had taught him, letting the ice heal, allowing new snow to fall, trusting that transformation was real and complete. One night, many months after that walk to the frozen pond, Koji was lying in his room when a particularly vivid memory arose, one of the worst things he had done, something that had haunted him for years. But this time, instead of the familiar cascade of shame and self-hatred, he felt something entirely different. He felt compassion. Compassion for the person he had been, lost and suffering and acting from pain. Compassion for the people he had hurt, who had their own journeys of healing to walk. Compassion for everyone involved in that situation, all of them doing their best, all of them stumbling through life, all of them human and flawed and worthy of forgiveness. And in that moment of compassion, the memory lost its power to torture him. It became simply something that had happened, a fact of his history, a stone that had hit the ice and was now at the bottom of the pond, while the surface above had healed and been covered with new snow. He fell asleep, held by a tenderness toward himself he had never allowed, resting in the recognition that he was worthy of peace, not despite his past, but including his past, all of it part of the journey that had brought him here. The next morning, he found Aishin in the meditation hall and simply bowed deeply, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, teacher," he whispered. "You showed me that guilt kept fresh by constant remembering is not responsibility. That transformation is real, that I could acknowledge the past without being destroyed by it." Aishin smiled with warmth that seemed to fill the entire hall. "You showed yourself through your own courageous practice of compassion. Now you know something precious. The ice heals, new snow falls, the past is past, and you can rest. As you lie here now, is there something from your past that you have been carrying, some guilt or shame that keeps you from peace? Can you practice what Koji learned? Acknowledge that it happened. Feel genuine remorse if that is true for you. And then practice letting the ice heal. The past cannot hurt you anymore unless you keep throwing stones through memory. Let new snow fall. Let yourself rest in the recognition that you have transformed, that you are worthy of peace, that the burden can finally be set down." Our fourth story takes us to a village by a great river, where the water flowed endlessly toward the sea, where fishermen worked from sunrise to sunset, where life moved to the rhythm of tides and seasons. Here lived a woman named Keiko, who worked as a weaver, creating cloth of such beauty and intricacy that people came from distant provinces to purchase her work. But Keiko lived in constant fear of the future. What if her skill faded as she aged? What if her eyes failed and she could no longer see the fine threads? What if tastes changed and people no longer wanted her style of weaving? What if she could no longer support herself? These worries spun through her mind like threads on a loom, weaving patterns of anxiety that kept her awake night after night, staring into darkness, imagining every possible disaster. The anxiety created a terrible cycle. The lack of sleep made her work suffer, which created more anxiety, which made sleep even more elusive. Her hands would shake from exhaustion as she worked the loom. Her eyes would blur from sleepless nights, and each small imperfection in her weaving would send her spiraling into deeper fear. This was it. This was the beginning of the end she had been dreading, proof that her worst fears were coming true. One day, a Buddhist monk named Takuan was passing through the village and stopped to watch Keiko working at her loom. He stood for a long time, observing how her hands moved with practiced grace despite her exhaustion, how the threads came together to form intricate patterns, how something beautiful emerged from simple materials through patient, skilled work. "Your weaving is extraordinary," Takuan said finally, his voice gentle and warm. "But I notice your face is tight with worry, your shoulders tense with anxiety. Your hands know their work perfectly, but your mind seems to be somewhere far from here." Keiko looked up, and something about Takuan's kind, weathered face made her defenses crumble. Before she quite meant to, she found herself pouring out her fears, all the worries about the future, all the sleepless nights imagining disaster, all the exhaustion of carrying anxiety as a constant companion. Takuan listened with complete attention, and when Keiko finished, he asked a simple question. "When you are weaving, completely absorbed in your work, your hands moving in their practice patterns, your attention fully on the threads in those moments, where is the future you fear?" Keiko paused, genuinely considering the question. When she was completely absorbed in weaving, when her hands were moving and her eyes were tracking the pattern, when she was fully present to the work itself, the future did not exist. There were no thoughts about what might happen next year or next month. There was only this thread, this moment, this simple act of creation. "It is not there," she said slowly, beginning to understand something. "When I am fully present to my work, there is no future to worry about." Takuan nodded, a gentle smile crossing his face. This is because the future does not exist except as a thought arising in the present moment. When you are fully present to what is actually here, the loom, the threads, the weaving, there is no future to fear. There is only this moment, and this moment is always workable, always manageable, always okay. He gestured for permission to sit, and Keiko nodded. Takuan settled onto a cushion near the loom. You torture yourself with thoughts about a future that may never come. You spend your present moments suffering about imagined future moments, and in doing so, you miss the only moment you can ever actually live in, this one. And this moment, right now, are you okay? Do you have food today? Can your hands weave today? Can your eyes see today? Keiko looked around her workshop, really looked for perhaps the first time in months. She had food, she had shelter, her hands were working, her eyes could see. In this actual present moment, not in some imagined catastrophic future, everything was okay. The disaster existed only in her thoughts, not in reality. But surely it is wise to prepare for the future, Keiko protested, clinging to her familiar patterns of thinking. Surely I should plan, should worry, should try to protect myself against what might happen. There is a profound difference, Takuan said gently, between practical preparation and anxious worrying. Practical preparation happens in the present moment. You save some money today. You practice your craft today. You take care of your health today. These are present moment actions grounded in what is actually here. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But anxious worrying is living in an imagined future, suffering about things that are not happening and may never happen, missing the life that is actually unfolding right now. When you lie awake at night imagining your eyes failing, your hands shaking, your work being rejected, none of those things are happening. They are phantoms, ghosts, stories your mind tells about what might be. Takuan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the river flowing past. The river does not worry about whether it will reach the ocean. The birds do not worry about next season's migration. They engage fully with what is here now, and they trust that they will meet the next moment when it arrives, not before. This is not foolishness. This is wisdom. This is how life actually works when we stop interfering with anxious thinking. That evening, Takuan taught Keiko a practice that would transform her relationship with worry. When you notice your mind spinning into future fears, he said, bring yourself back to this simple question. Am I okay right now, in this actual present moment, not in some imagined future, but right here, right now? And if the answer is yes, if in this moment you have breath and food and shelter and the ability to meet what is actually here, then rest in that okayness. Let the future be the future. It will arrive when it arrives, and you will meet it then, not now. Keiko began practicing this teaching, and at first, it felt almost impossible. Her mind had spent years training itself to worry, spinning constantly into imagined futures, rehearsing disasters that had never happened and might never happen. The habit was deeply grooved, automatic, almost unconscious. But each time she noticed the worry arising, she would pause and ask herself Takuan's question, am I okay right now? And almost always, the answer was yes. Right now, in this actual moment, she was okay. The disaster was not happening. The feared future had not arrived. There was only this breath, this moment, this present reality which was, nearly always, workable and manageable. At night, when she lay down, and the worries would begin their familiar parade through her mind. What if this? What if that? What if everything falls apart? She would practice the same question. Am I okay right now? And yes, right now she was lying in a comfortable bed. Right now she was safe and warm. Right now, in this actual present moment, she was okay. The future the worries spoke about was not happening. It existed only as thought, as imagination, as mental construction. And she could let those thoughts be like clouds passing through the sky, coming and going, while she rested in the okayness of this actual moment. Sleep began to come more easily. Not perfectly, not without any worry at all, but more often, more deeply, with longer stretches of actual rest. because she was learning to live in the present moment rather than in an imagined future, to meet what was actually here rather than suffering about what might be there. One night, several months after meeting Takuan, Keiko was lying in bed when a particularly vivid worry arose. A detailed scenario of her business failing, her becoming destitute, losing everything she had worked for. The fear felt real, immediate, overwhelming. But this time, instead of getting caught in the story, instead of following the thought into its dark spiral, she asked the question that had become her anchor. Am I okay right now? And she felt it deeply, not just intellectually but in her whole body, in her whole being. Right now, in this moment, she was okay. She was breathing. She was safe. She was held by this moment which was, in itself, complete and workable. The future would come when it came, and she would meet it then with whatever resources she had then. But right now, she could rest. She fell asleep, held by the present moment, by the okayness that is always here when we stop projecting ourselves into imagined futures, by the peace that exists not tomorrow or next year but right now, in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this simple fact of being alive. Months later, when Takuan passed through the village again, Keiko invited him to see her latest work. Her weaving had actually improved, the patterns more confident, the colors more vibrant. How is this possible? Takuan asked with a knowing smile. I thought you feared your skill was fading. Keiko laughed, a sound of genuine lightness. When I stopped spending my energy worrying about the future, I had more energy to give to the present. My work improved, not because I worried less about it failing, but because I was more fully present to the actual act of weaving. You showed me that I was spending my life suffering about a future that never comes, missing the life that is actually here. Takuan nodded with deep satisfaction. The Buddha taught that suffering comes from tanha, craving, wanting the present to be different than it is. When we are here, fully present to what actually is, there is no suffering. The suffering comes from our thoughts about the past, our worries about the future. But this moment, as it actually is always workable. As you rest here now, can you practice what Keiko learned? Can you ask yourself, am I okay right now? In this actual present moment, not in some imagined future, not in some remembered past, but right here, right now. You are breathing, you are safe, you are held by this moment. The future will come when it comes, and you will meet it then. But for now, you can rest in the okayness of this present moment, which is always here, always available, always enough. Our fifth story takes us to a monastery where the meditation hall overlooked a valley so vast that on clear days you could see mountain ranges in 3 directions, and on foggy mornings the world would disappear into white mist that made the temple feel like it was floating in clouds. Here lived a nun named Midori who had been practicing meditation for 12 years, sitting every day without fail, following the instructions carefully, dedicating herself completely to the path. But Midori felt like a failure. Her mind was never quiet during meditation. Thoughts arose in endless streams, memories, plans, judgments, fantasies, worries cascading one after another like a waterfall that never stopped flowing. She would try to focus on her breath, but within seconds, her mind would be somewhere else entirely, lost in thought, completely distracted from the practice. She looked around the meditation hall at the other nuns who sat in such apparent stillness, their faces peaceful, their posture unwavering, and she felt crushing inadequacy. They could do it. They could quiet their minds. Why couldn't she? What was wrong with her? Was she simply not suited for meditation? Did she lack some essential quality that real practitioners possessed? The sense of failure followed her into the night. She would lie in bed replaying her meditation sessions, judging herself for every wandering thought, comparing herself to others who seemed to meditate so easily, drowning in shame about being bad at the one thing she had dedicated her life to. Sleep became difficult because the thoughts that plagued her during meditation also plagued her at night, endless, relentless, exhausting. One morning, after a particularly difficult night, Midori approached her teacher, an elderly nun named Jiko who had practiced for over 70 years. "Teacher," Midori said, her voice breaking with frustration and exhaustion, "I cannot meditate. My mind never stops. I have tried everything, counting breaths, watching thoughts, noting sensations. Nothing works. My mind is too wild, too chaotic. Everyone else can sit peacefully, but I cannot. Perhaps I should leave the monastery and find some other path. Chico looked at her with eyes that held infinite kindness, eyes that had seen this struggle countless times in countless students over the decades. Tell me, Chico said gently, right now, in this moment, are you aware that thoughts are arising? Midori nodded, confused by the question. Yes, of course. That is the problem. I am constantly aware of how many thoughts I am having, how distracted I am. And this awareness that knows thoughts are arising, Chico asked, is it thinking? Midori paused, genuinely considering this question for the first time. When she noticed that thoughts were arising, when she recognized that her mind had wandered, there was a moment of awareness, of knowing, and in that moment, the awareness itself was not thinking. It was simply observing, simply knowing, simply present. No, Midori said slowly, something beginning to dawn. The awareness that knows I am thinking is not itself thinking. It is just aware. Chico smiled, her weathered face creasing with warmth. This is the key you have been missing, the understanding that could transform your entire practice. You have been trying to stop thoughts, believing that successful meditation means having no thoughts, achieving some blank state of mental emptiness. But this is not meditation. This is warfare with yourself, and it is a war you cannot win because thoughts arising is what minds naturally do. She gestured to the meditation hall around them, to the space that held everything. True meditation is not about controlling thoughts or making your mind stop. It is about recognizing the awareness that knows all thoughts, the consciousness that witnesses thinking without being defined by thoughts. Your thoughts come and go like weather, sometimes many clouds, sometimes few, sometimes none. But the sky that holds all weather is never disturbed by any weather. Chico stood and walked to the window overlooking the valley. You are like the sky, Midori. The thoughts are like clouds passing through. You have been identifying with the clouds, believing you are the thoughts, treating every wandering thought as a personal failure. But you are not the thoughts. You are the sky, the awareness in which thoughts arise and pass, the spacious presence that witnesses everything without being disturbed by anything. Midori felt something shifting in her understanding, like a door opening to reveal a room she had not known existed. So, when I notice my mind has wandered, instead of judging myself, I should recognize the awareness that is doing the noticing. Yes, Chico replied, and more than that, recognize that this awareness is always here, always present, always available, even when you are completely lost in thought. Awareness is there, otherwise you could not eventually notice you were lost and return. Even in the midst of the wildest mental storm, awareness remains, like the sky that is still there even when completely covered by clouds. Chico continued, her voice soft and steady. When you sit in meditation, do not try to control thoughts or force your mind to be quiet. This creates tension, creates struggle, creates the very agitation you are trying to escape. Instead, rest in awareness. Notice thoughts arising, notice them passing, but do not become them. Do not add the thought, I should not be thinking, to the thoughts that are already present. Simply be the awareness that knows thoughts are happening, the way the sky knows clouds are present without being disturbed by them. Over the following days and weeks, Midori practiced this new understanding, and it transformed her meditation completely. When she sat and thoughts arose, which they did constantly, endlessly, she no longer fought them. She simply noticed them as arisings in awareness. A thought about her teacher appeared. She noticed it like noticing a cloud. A memory from childhood surfaced. Another cloud drifting through. A worry about tomorrow arose. Another cloud. She let them all be, let them all pass, resting in the awareness that witnessed everything without grasping anything. Gradually, something profound began to happen. Midori discovered that awareness was always peaceful, always spacious, always at ease, even when thoughts were chaotic, even when mental activity was intense. The storm of thinking might be happening in awareness, but awareness itself was like vast space that could hold any weather without being disturbed by it. And at night, when she lay down to sleep, she brought this same understanding. Thoughts would arise, reviews of the day, plans for tomorrow, endless mental chatter. But instead of fighting them, instead of believing she needed a quiet mind to sleep, she simply rested in the awareness that new thoughts were happening. The thoughts were like clouds passing through the sky of her mind, sometimes many, sometimes few. But beneath them all, awareness remained spacious and peaceful and unchanging. And in resting as this awareness rather than as the thoughts, sleep began to come more naturally, more easily. One night, several weeks into this practice, Midori was lying in bed when a particularly intense storm of thoughts arose. Worries, memories, plans, everything churning at once. The old Midori would have panicked, would have judged herself harshly, would have spent hours fighting the thoughts and making them worse. But this Midori simply rested in the awareness that knew the storm was happening. She did not try to stop the thoughts. She did not judge herself for thinking. She simply remained as the sky, vast and open and at peace, while clouds moved through in whatever patterns they moved. And something extraordinary happened. She saw clearly, with a clarity that went beyond words, that awareness was completely untouched by the storm. No matter how intense the thoughts were, no matter how overwhelming the mental activity seemed, awareness remained spacious, peaceful, clear, unchanged. The storm was happening in awareness, but awareness itself was never disturbed. The next morning, Midori went to Jiko with eyes bright with recognition. "Teacher, I understand now. I have been trying to clear the sky of clouds, not realizing that I am the sky. The sky does not need to be empty of clouds to be the sky. Awareness does not need to be empty of thoughts to be awareness. I can rest in awareness regardless of what thoughts are present." Jiko smiled with deep joy. "Yes, Midori, and now you know something essential about your true nature. You are not your thoughts. You are not your busy mind. You are the awareness in which all these things appear and disappear. This awareness is always at peace, always spacious, always here. It is what you truly are. And now you can rest not because your mind has become quiet, but because you know you are not your mind. You are the awareness that witnesses mind, the sky that holds all weather. As you rest here now, breathing softly in the darkness, can you practice what Midori learned? Can you notice that you are aware of lying here, aware of breathing, aware of thoughts if thoughts are present? This awareness that knows everything, it is not disturbed by what it knows. It is like the sky holding clouds, vast and spacious and fundamentally at peace. You do not need to stop thinking to rest. You only need to recognize that you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts arise and pass. Rest as this awareness now. Let thoughts come and go like clouds, and remain as the vast spaciousness that is always here, always peaceful, always home. Our sixth story takes us to a small village nestled in a valley where rice fields stretched like green mirrors reflecting the sky, where farmers worked in rhythm with seasons that had repeated for countless generations, where life was simple but not always easy. Here lived a man named Osamu who had achieved everything he thought would bring him happiness. Osamu had built a successful farm through decades of hard work. He had raised 4 children who were now adults living their own lives. He had earned the respect of his community, had accumulated enough wealth to live comfortably, had a wife who loved him. By every external measure, he had lived a good life, had accomplished what he set out to accomplish. But as Osamu grew older and began to reflect on his life, he was tormented by a regret so painful it kept him awake most nights. Not regret for what he had done wrong, but regret for what he had not done at all. The dreams he had abandoned when responsibility called, the adventures he had been too cautious to pursue, the artist he might have become if he had followed his passion for painting instead of choosing the security of farming. These regrets haunted him like ghosts. He would lie in the darkness, thinking about the life he might have lived if only he had been braver, more adventurous, more willing to take risks. He had played it safe, had chosen security over dreams, had let fear guide his choices. And now he was old, and it was too late to go back, too late to choose differently, too late to live the life he now believed he should have lived. The regret was a weight that grew heavier as time passed, a sense of having wasted his one precious life being cautious, of having chosen the small safe path when there was a wider road calling. Sleep became nearly impossible because lying in bed gave space for these thoughts to consume him, for the might-have-beens to parade through his mind in an endless procession of lost possibilities. One day, a wandering Buddhist monk named Bankei came through the village, and Osamu, desperate for some wisdom that might ease his suffering, sought him out. They met in a quiet tea house, and Osamu poured out his regrets, his voice thick with the grief of unlived possibilities, with the pain of roads not taken. "I am haunted by the life I did not live," Osamu said, tears forming in his eyes. "I chose security over adventure, practicality over passion. I have a good life, yes, but it is not the life I should have lived. I should have been an artist. I should have traveled. I should have been braver. And now I am old, and it is too late, and I cannot sleep because I cannot stop thinking about all I missed, all I gave up, all the might-have-beens that will never be." Bankei listened with complete attention, his face showing neither judgment nor pity, only deep presence. When Osamu finished, Bankei asked a question that surprised him. "Tell me about your children. Do you love them?" Osamu was confused by the question. "Of course I love my children. They are the greatest joy of my life. And were you able to be present for them? To raise them? To watch them grow? Because you chose the stability of farming? Because you stayed in this village rather than wandering the world?" Osamu had to admit this was true. His choice of a stable, predictable life had allowed him to be there for his family, to provide for them, to be present for every important moment of his children's lives. If he had chased his dreams of being an artist or traveling, he would have missed all of that. "And your farm," Bankei continued, "has it provided food for your village? Has it employed workers? Has it contributed to your community?" Again, Osamu had to acknowledge this was true. His practical choices had created value beyond himself, had helped many people, had contributed to the well-being of his community. "So you chose one path," Bankei said gently, "and that path had its own beauty, its own gifts, its own meaning. Yes, there were other paths you did not take. There always are. Every choice we make closes off other possibilities. This is not a flaw in how you lived. This is simply how life works. To choose one thing is always to not choose countless other things." Bankei poured tea for both of them, the simple act done with complete presence. You torture yourself by comparing the life you actually lived with an imagined life that exists only in your fantasy. But that imagined life is not real. It never was real. It is a ghost. A story you tell yourself about what might have been if everything had gone perfectly, if you had been braver, if circumstances had been different. He looked directly at Osamu with eyes that held both compassion and challenge. "But you do not actually know what that other life would have been like. Perhaps you would have been a struggling artist, bitter and poor, unable to support yourself, filled with different regrets. Perhaps you would have traveled the world and felt lonely and disconnected, longing for the roots and community you gave up. Perhaps the risks you regret not taking would have led to disaster, to harm, to suffering you cannot even imagine." Osamu felt something stirring in him, some possibility he had not considered. "But surely some regret is natural. Surely it means something that I wish I had lived differently. Regret can be a teacher," Bankei said softly, "if it shows us something we want to change going forward. But the regret you carry is not that kind. You are not regretting something you can still change. You are regretting the past itself, demanding that it be different than it was, refusing to accept that the choices you made were the choices you made, that the life you lived is the life you lived." He paused, letting this settle. The Buddha taught that all suffering comes from wanting reality to be different than it is. You are suffering not because your life was wrong or wasted, but because you are comparing it to a fantasy and finding it lacking. You are choosing a ghost over reality, an imagined life over the actual life you lived. Bankei stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rice fields that Osamu had tended for decades. The life you actually lived was real. It happened. It had love in it, your children, your wife, your community. It had meaning in it, feeding people, employing workers, contributing to something larger than yourself. It had beauty in it, the changing seasons, the cycle of planting and harvest, the rhythm of a life lived close to the earth. He turned back to Osamu. The life you imagine you should have lived is a fantasy. It exists only in your mind, only in your thoughts about what might have been, and you are choosing the fantasy over the reality, the ghost over what actually was. This is the source of your suffering, and this is why you cannot rest. Over the following weeks, Osamu practiced what Bankei had taught him. When the familiar regrets arose as he lay in bed, the thoughts about the artist he might have been, the traveler he might have become, the braver person he should have been, he would bring himself back to reality. He would think about his children, whom he loved deeply and had been able to be present for because of his choices. He would think about his grandchildren, who existed only because he had chosen the path he chose. He would think about the workers whose families he had fed through decades of steady employment. He would think about the community he had served through reliable food production. His life had not been dramatic or adventurous, but it had been real. It had been lived with love and dedication and responsibility. And there was beauty in that, meaning in that, even if it was not the fantasy life he sometimes imagined he should have lived. For the first time in years, Osamu felt something shift. A softening toward himself, toward his choices, toward the life he had actually lived, rather than the fantasy life he had not lived. He had done his best with what he knew at the time. He had loved. He had cared. He had built something of value. This was not wasted. This was a life, real and complete in its own way. He began to sleep again. Not perfectly, not without occasional visits from regret, but more often, more deeply. He could rest now in reality rather than tormenting himself with fantasy, in acceptance rather than resistance, in gratitude for what was rather than grief for what was not. One morning, several months after meeting Bankei, Osamu woke early and went to his small studio where he kept his painting supplies, neglected for decades. He set up a canvas and began to paint the view from his window, the rice fields he had tended for so long, the mountains beyond, the morning light that he had seen 10,000 times but never really looked at until now. He was not the artist he might have been if he had chosen that path decades ago, but he could be an artist now, in this moment, with the life he actually had. The past could not be changed, but the present was always available. He had not wasted his life. He had lived it, and he could continue living it, right now, making choices that honored both the reality of what was and the possibilities of what could still be. That night, Osamu slept deeply, his hands still faintly marked with paint, his heart at peace with the life he had lived and the life he was still living. He dreamed not of might-have-beens, but of what was the morning light on rice fields, the faces of his grandchildren, the simple beauty of a life fully lived, imperfect and real and complete. As you rest here now, can you let go of comparing your life to imagined alternatives? Can you release the regret for roads not taken, dreams not pursued, choices made differently? Every choice involves letting go of other possibilities. This is not failure. This is simply how life works. The life you have actually lived is real. It has meaning. It is enough. Rest in this recognition. Let the ghosts of unlived lives dissolve. Be present to what actually is, and let yourself sleep in the peace of accepting reality rather than fighting it with fantasy. Our seventh story takes us to a temple where cherry blossoms bloomed every spring in such profusion that the ground would be carpeted in pink petals and the air would smell sweet for weeks. Here lived a monk named Yuji who had achieved something remarkable in the eyes of his community. He had memorized hundreds of sutras, could recite Buddhist philosophy with scholarly precision, could explain the most complex teachings with clarity and eloquence. Other monks would come to Yuji with questions about doctrine, about the proper interpretation of texts, about the philosophical positions of different schools. He could answer them all with impressive knowledge, citing sources, making distinctions, demonstrating a mastery of Buddhist scholarship that was genuinely exceptional. But Yuji was miserable. The more he learned, the more confused he became. Different teachers said different things, different texts contradicted each other, different traditions emphasized different practices. He had filled his mind with so much spiritual knowledge that he could barely think straight anymore, could barely sleep for all the different teachings competing for attention in his consciousness, all the unanswered questions, all the philosophical puzzles he could not solve. He would lie awake at night, trying to reconcile contradictions in the texts, trying to figure out which teaching was the most correct, trying to understand why different masters gave different answers to the same questions. The more he studied, the further he seemed to get from the peace and clarity the teachings were supposed to provide. One day, the temple's abbot, a very old monk named Sengai, who rarely spoke but who carried a quality of profound simplicity, asked to see Yuji. When Yuji arrived at Sengai's simple quarters, he found the old monk sitting quietly, and spread before him were all the books Yuji had been studying: dozens of sutras, commentaries, philosophical treatises, scholarly works. "You have studied all of this," Sengai said, gesturing to the books. It was not a question. "Yes, master," Yuji replied. "I have read every text, memorized the important passages, studied the commentaries. I know the different schools of thought, the historical debates, the philosophical positions." "Stand up," Sengai said simply. Yuji stood, confused. "Walk to the door." Yuji walked to the door. "Come back and sit down." Yuji returned and sat, waiting for the teaching, for the explanation of what this exercise had meant. "When you walked to the door," Sengai asked, "did you need to consult these books? Did you need to know the Buddhist theories of walking? Did you need to understand the philosophical positions on movement?" "No, master," Yuji replied. "I just walked." "And yet you walked perfectly," Sengai said with a slight smile. "Your body knew how to walk, your legs knew how to move. You did not need all this knowledge to do what comes naturally." He gestured to the pile of books. "All this learning, all these teachings, all these practices, they are like instruction manuals for walking, given to someone who already knows how to walk. They are fingers pointing at the moon, but you have become so busy studying the fingers, comparing the fingers, analyzing which finger is pointing most correctly, that you have completely forgotten to look at the moon." Sengai stood slowly and walked to the window. The Buddha nature that all these texts speak about, the enlightenment that all these practices point toward, it is not something you need to acquire through accumulating knowledge. It is what you already are beneath all the knowledge, beneath all the confusion, beneath all the seeking. It is as natural to you as walking. He turned back to Yuji, his expression holding both gentleness and directness. "You have spent years filling your mind with knowledge about enlightenment. Now I invite you to spend time emptying your mind of all that knowledge, returning to the simple, direct experience of being alive, of being present, of being what you already are before any teaching was learned, before any practice was attempted, before any philosophy was studied." Yuji felt something breaking open inside him, some knot of confusion beginning to untie. "But master, what about all this study? Was it wasted? Did I spend years learning things that do not matter?" "Not wasted," Sengai replied gently, gathering up the books and placing them on a shelf. "But perhaps the value was not in the knowledge itself, but in bringing you to this point of recognizing that knowledge alone cannot provide what you seek. You have learned everything you can learn about enlightenment. Now you can unlearn, can let go, can return to the simplicity that was here all along, before all the learning complicated it." In the days that followed, Yuji began a practice of unlearning. When complicated philosophical questions arose in his mind, he would let them go without trying to answer them. When debates about Buddhist doctrine appeared in his thoughts, he would release them without engaging. When the urge came to analyze and compare and understand through intellectual frameworks, he would gently return to simple presence. He began to live more like the trees in the garden, not thinking about being alive, just being alive, not analyzing experience, just experiencing, not seeking enlightenment through knowledge, just being what he already was beneath all the seeking. And sleep began to come more easily, because his mind was no longer so crowded with competing teachings and philosophical positions and different practices to master. He could rest in simplicity, in not knowing, in the vast spaciousness that exists before the mind fills it with concepts and theories and elaborate understandings. One night, several months into this practice of unlearning, Yuji was lying in bed when his mind tried to engage with a complex philosophical question about emptiness that he had studied for years. But instead of following the thought into its elaborate reasoning, instead of trying to solve the puzzle intellectually, he simply let it be like a cloud passing through the sky of his awareness. And in the space where that thought had been, where usually another thought would immediately arise to replace it, there was just space. Just awareness. Just the simple fact of being here, breathing, alive, present. Not complicated by knowledge, not obscured by learning, not confused by competing teachings. Just this. He recognized in that moment what Sengai had been pointing to. Enlightenment was not something he would achieve by accumulating more knowledge, or mastering more practices, or understanding more philosophy. It was what remained when he let go of all the knowledge, all the practices, all the seeking. It was the simple awareness that had been here all along, before he learned anything about Buddhism, before he started practicing, before he began his spiritual search. The next morning, Yuji went to Sengai and simply bowed deeply, no words needed. Sengai nodded with recognition and warmth. "Now your real practice begins," he said quietly. "Not the practice of accumulating knowledge, but the practice of living from this simple awareness, of returning again and again to what you are beneath all the learning. As you rest here now, can you practice this unlearning? Can you let go of all the accumulated knowledge about how to rest, about what peace should feel like, about the right way to be in this moment? Can you return to the simplicity of just being here, just breathing, just present, without all the complicated teachings about how this should be? You already know how to rest, just like you know how to walk. You do not need to learn it from teachings. You only need to stop interfering with what your body and being already know how to do. Let go of the knowledge. Return to simplicity. Just be here. Just this. Just now." Our eighth story takes us to a seaside village where the sound of waves was a constant companion, where fishermen's boats dotted the harbor like colorful birds, where life moved to the rhythm of tides that had ebbed and flowed for millennia. Here lived a potter named Fumiko, who created vessels of such technical perfection that collectors would pay extraordinary sums for her work. Every curve was exact, every surface was smooth as glass, every proportion was mathematically precise. Fumiko would spend weeks on a single piece, measuring and adjusting, sanding and refinishing, starting over at the slightest imperfection. Her pursuit of perfection was absolute, uncompromising, all-consuming. But Fumiko could not rest. The perfectionism that made her work so admired was the same thing that kept her from sleep, from peace, from any sense that her work was ever complete. Every night she would lie awake, her mind reviewing every piece she had made, finding flaws invisible to others but glaring to her perfectionist eye. A curve that was slightly off, a glaze that was not quite even, a proportion that could have been better. The exhaustion was crushing. She could barely hold her tools steady anymore, her hands shaking from sleepless nights, and the shaking made her work suffer, which created more anxiety, which made sleep even more impossible. She was caught in a cycle that seemed to have no escape. The more she pursued perfection, the more it eluded her, and the more desperately she pursued it. One day, an elderly Buddhist monk named Rikyu came to her studio. He had heard about her perfect pottery and wanted to see it for himself. Fumiko showed him her work, flawless vessels lined up in perfect rows, each one technically impeccable, each one a masterpiece of control and precision. Rikyu examined them carefully, taking his time, and finally he spoke. "These are technically perfect," he said. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but they are also cold, distant, lifeless. They show your skill, but they do not show your heart. They demonstrate mastery, but they do not reveal humanity." Fumiko felt defensive, almost angry. This monk, who probably knew nothing about pottery, was criticizing her life's work, the perfection she had sacrificed everything to achieve. But Rikyu continued gently, picking up one of her flawless bowls. "In the way of tea, in Zen, we have a concept called wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. It recognizes that perfection is sterile, that it creates distance rather than connection, that the irregularities and marks of the maker's hand are what make something alive, what give it soul." He set down the perfect bowl and gestured to a small cup Fumiko had made years ago, before her obsession with perfection had taken over. A piece she kept hidden because it had visible finger marks in the clay. slight asymmetry in the rim, an uneven glaze that she considered a failure. "This," Rikyu said, picking up the imperfect cup, "this has warmth, this has life, this has humanity. I can feel the hands that made it. I can sense the person behind the work. This cup invites connection because it is honest about being handmade, about being imperfect, about being real." He looked at Fumiko with eyes that held profound compassion. "You are exhausting yourself in pursuit of an ideal that is actually making your work less alive, less touching, less able to connect with human hearts. Perfection is impressive, yes, but it is also cold. It says, admire me from a distance rather than use me. Touch me, let me be part of your daily life." Over the following weeks, Fumiko began to experiment with allowing imperfection. She stopped immediately starting over when something was not quite perfect. She let the marks of her hands show in the clay. She accepted slight irregularities in shape and glaze. She allowed her humanity to be visible in her work rather than hidden beneath layers of control and precision. At first, it felt like failure, like she was betraying everything she had worked for, like she was giving up standards and letting herself become sloppy. But gradually, she began to see what Rikyu had pointed to. There was a warmth in these imperfect pieces, a life, an honesty that her perfect work had lacked. And something else happened. As she released the demand for perfection in her work, as she allowed imperfection to be okay, the constant anxiety began to ease. She no longer lay awake replaying every tiny flaw, judging herself for not achieving impossible standards. She could rest in the recognition that good enough was actually good enough, that beauty included irregularity, that her worth was not measured by perfection. Sleep began to come more naturally, not perfectly, not without any self-judgment at all, but more often, more deeply. She could lie down and instead of cataloging failures, she could feel gratitude for what she had created, for the life that was in her work now, for the freedom that came from accepting imperfection. One night, many months after Rikyu's visit, Fumiko was preparing to close her studio when she noticed a new crack forming in one of her favorite bowls. The old Fumiko would have felt devastation, would have stayed awake all night, grieving the loss of perfection. But this Fumiko simply ran her finger along the crack and smiled, thinking about kintsugi, about repairing it with gold lacquer so the crack would become the most beautiful thing about the bowl. That night, she slept deeply, dreaming of golden cracks spreading through perfect surfaces, of beauty that included brokenness, of a life that was perfectly, wonderfully, beautifully imperfect. As you rest here now, can you practice what Fumiko learned? Can you let go of demanding perfection from this moment, from your rest, from yourself? Can you accept that cracks and irregularities and imperfections are part of your story, evidence of a life being lived, beautiful in their honesty? You do not need to be perfect to deserve rest. You can sleep now, exactly as you are, imperfect and whole, flawed and complete, human and worthy. Let go of the demand for perfection. Let yourself be real, be here, be imperfect, and at peace. Our ninth story takes us to mountains so high that snow never fully melted even in summer, where the air was thin and clear, where a temple had stood for 500 years, carved partially into the living rock of the mountain itself. Here lived a monk named Tetsuya, who practiced with such rigid discipline that other monks spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and concern. Tetsuya woke at exactly 4 in the morning, not a minute earlier or later. He meditated for exactly the prescribed hours, sitting in perfect posture, following every instruction with absolute precision. He ate exactly what was served without preference or complaint, chewing each bite the exact number of times the ancient texts recommended. He spoke only when permitted, maintained silence when required, moved through his days with rigid adherence to every rule, no matter how minor. To an outsider, Tetsuya appeared to be the perfect practitioner, the ideal monk, someone who embodied discipline and dedication. But inside, Tetsuya was suffering. He felt imprisoned by the very rules that were supposed to liberate him, suffocated by schedules, exhausted by the constant monitoring of himself to ensure he was doing everything correctly. Sleep became difficult because even in his dreams he was following rules, checking himself, making sure he was being a good practitioner. He would wake multiple times each night in panic, worried that he had broken some precept in his sleep, that he had somehow failed even while unconscious. One day, a wandering monk named Hakuin came to stay at the temple. Hakuin was famous throughout the region, though not for his discipline or strict adherence to rules. He was known for his freedom, his spontaneity, his ability to be fully present to each moment without being bound by forms or expectations. Yet the most respected teachers spoke of him with profound reverence. The abbot assigned Tetsuya to attend to Hakuin during his visit, and Tetsuya was deeply skeptical. How could someone so apparently undisciplined, so lacking in rigor, be considered an authentic practitioner? Tetsuya was determined to show Hakuin what real practice looked like through his own perfect adherence to form. That first morning, Tetsuya woke at exactly 4 and went to wake Hakuin for the early meditation session in the hall. But when he reached Hakuin's room, he found the old monk already awake, sitting by the window watching the dawn break over the mountains with such complete absorption that Tetsuya stopped in his tracks, his planned words of instruction dying on his lips. Hakuin was not in the meditation hall where he should have been. He was not sitting in the prescribed posture. He was simply gazing at the sunrise with a presence so total that the room itself seemed to shimmer with stillness. "Master Hakuin," Tetsuya finally said, unable to keep the judgment from his voice, "morning meditation is in the hall. This is the schedule. This is the form. This is how practice is done here." Hakuin turned to look at him, his ancient face creasing in a smile that held no defensiveness, only warmth. "But I am practicing. I am meditating with the dawn. Is this not practice?" Tetsuya felt frustration rising. "But there is a schedule, there are rules, there is a correct way to practice. This is the discipline." "And is the purpose of the schedule to follow the schedule?" Hakuin asked gently. "Or is the purpose of the schedule to support awakening? If I am already awake to this moment, already fully present to this sunrise, what would sitting in the hall add? Would it make this moment more sacred?" Throughout that day, Tetsuya continued to be confused and somewhat scandalized by Hakuin's behavior. During the work period, while other monks labored in disciplined silence as the rules required, Hakuin hummed quietly to himself, clearly taking delight in the simple task of sweeping leaves. During meals, while Tetsuya ate with perfect neutrality, Hakuin openly expressed pleasure when he tasted something good, making small sounds of appreciation, savoring each bite with obvious enjoyment. That evening, Tetsuya could no longer contain himself. "Forgive me, Master Hakuin, but I do not understand. You do not follow the schedule. You do not maintain rigorous discipline. You express preferences and emotions that the rules say we should transcend. How is this practice? How is this the path to enlightenment?" Hakuin set down his tea and looked at Tetsuya with infinite kindness. "Tell me, why do you practice so rigorously? What are you seeking through all this discipline? To achieve liberation," Tetsuya replied, as if this were obvious. "To become enlightened. And do you feel free?" Hakuin asked quietly. The question struck Tetsuya like a physical blow. He realized with devastating clarity that he did not feel free at all. He felt imprisoned by rules, trapped by schedules, suffocated by his constant monitoring of whether he was doing everything correctly. Every moment was filtered through judgment about his performance, about whether he was being a good practitioner. "No," Tetsuya admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do not feel free. I feel burdened." Hakuin nodded with deep compassion. "This is because you have confused the finger pointing at the moon with the moon itself. The rules, the discipline, the schedule, these are tools. They point at freedom, but you have become so focused on following them perfectly that you have forgotten to look at what they are pointing toward. You have made the form into the goal itself, and so the form has become a prison rather than a path." He poured more tea, the simple act done with such natural grace that it became a teaching. "In my early years, I practiced exactly as you do now. Rigid discipline, perfect adherence to every rule, constant self-monitoring. I was the model monk, but I was also miserable, exhausted, and I was not free. Not even close." Hakuin sipped his tea slowly. "One day, my teacher asked me a question that shattered everything I thought I knew about practice. He said, "If you are practicing to be free, why are you creating more prisons for yourself? If you are seeking liberation, why are you building more elaborate cages?" He looked directly at Tetsuya. True practice is not about following external forms perfectly. It is about being genuinely present, genuinely awake, genuinely engaged with life as it actually is. Sometimes that means sitting in the meditation hall, because that supports presence. Sometimes that means watching the sunrise from a window, because that is what presence is calling for in this moment. The form changes depending on what the moment needs. What matters is not the external form, but the quality of presence, the depth of awareness, the authenticity of engagement. Over the following weeks, after Hakuin had left the temple, Tetsuya's practice transformed completely. He still sat in meditation at the prescribed times, still followed the basic schedule, still engaged with the forms and rituals, but he did so from a different place. Not from fear of breaking rules, not from attachment to being seen as a perfect practitioner, but from genuine presence, from authentic engagement. And sometimes, when the schedule called for one thing but his deep listening called for another, he had the courage to trust his own awareness. One morning, he found himself drawn to watch the sunrise from the same window where he had first seen Hakuin sitting. He sat with the dawn light, fully present, not judging himself for deviating from the schedule, just being here with this extraordinary ordinary miracle of another day beginning. He experienced a quality of peace he had never touched in all his years of rigid discipline. Not because watching the sunrise was inherently superior to sitting in the hall, but because he was genuinely present rather than performing an idea of what practice should look like. And at night, when he lay down to rest, the difference was profound. He was no longer reviewing every moment of the day to check if he had followed every rule correctly. He was no longer judging himself for minor deviations from perfect form. He could simply rest, allowing the day to be complete, allowing himself to be enough exactly as he was. Sleep came more easily now, more naturally. Not every night perfectly, but more often, more deeply. Because he had learned that rest was not something to achieve through perfect discipline. It was something to allow through gentleness, through presence, through trusting that he would rest exactly as he needed to rest, without forcing or controlling it. Years later, when other monks came to Tetsuya struggling with the same rigid perfectionism he had struggled with, feeling imprisoned by discipline that was supposed to liberate them, he would share what Hakuin had taught him. "The forms and rules exist to support you, not to imprison you," he would say with compassion born of his own experience. "Use them when they help. Let them go when they hinder. Practice from presence rather than from fear, from genuine engagement rather than from obligation." As you rest here now, can you practice letting go of rigid perfectionism about rest itself? Can you release the demand that you rest perfectly, that you do this correctly, that you achieve some ideal state? The forms and techniques are meant to support you, not to create another thing you can fail at. Just be here, breathing, allowing whatever arises. You do not need to be perfect. You are already enough. Just rest. Our 10th story takes us to a village where a great river flowed, where boats carried goods and people up and down its wide expanse, where the water was the lifeblood of the community. Here lived a merchant named Ichiro, who had built a successful trading business through years of careful planning, strategic thinking, and constant vigilance. Ichiro prided himself on being prepared for every possibility. He maintained detailed records. He developed contingency plans for every scenario. He analyzed every decision from multiple angles before acting. Nothing was left to chance. Everything was controlled, managed, anticipated. But this constant planning and control came at an enormous cost. Ichiro could not rest because his mind never stopped working, never stopped preparing, never stopped trying to predict and prevent every possible problem. He would lie awake at night, running through scenarios, reviewing his plans, imagining what could go wrong and how he would handle it. The irony was that despite all his planning, despite all his preparation, his business was actually suffering. He was so busy preparing for the future that he missed opportunities in the present. He was so focused on preventing problems that he could not see possibilities. He was so consumed with control that he could not adapt when circumstances changed in ways he had not predicted. One day, an old fisherman named Goro invited Ichiro to go fishing with him. Goro was famous in the village not for catching the most fish he did not, but for his quality of ease, his evident peace, his ability to be fully present to whatever the river brought without anxiety or struggle. They took Goro's small boat out onto the river, and Ichiro immediately began asking questions. What is your strategy? How do you know where the fish will be? What is your plan if the weather changes? What if the current shifts? Goro simply smiled and began to paddle, his movements fluid and unhurried. I do not have a strategy, he said. I listen to the river. I feel where the current wants to take me. I notice where the fish are today, not where they were yesterday or where I think they will be tomorrow. I respond to what is actually here rather than trying to control what might be. Ichiro felt frustration rising. This seemed so careless, so irresponsible. But how can you run a business this way? How can you support yourself without planning, without preparation, without trying to predict and control outcomes? I do plan, Goro said gently, letting the boat drift with the current. I prepare my nets. I maintain my boat. I save money for lean times. But there is a difference between practical preparation and the kind of anxious control you are describing. Practical preparation happens in the present moment and then releases. Anxious control tries to grip the future, to force it to be what you want, to prevent all uncertainty. This is exhausting and ultimately impossible. He gestured to the river around them. The river teaches me everything I need to know about living skillfully. The river has enormous power, moves massive amounts of water, carves through rock over time, but it does not try to control where it goes. It follows the path of least resistance, working with gravity in the shape of the land rather than fighting against it. When it meets an obstacle, it flows around it or slowly wears it down. It does not struggle, it does not resist, it simply flows. Goro cast his line into the water. The movement so practiced it looked effortless. You are trying to control the river of your life, the way someone might try to control this river, grasping, forcing, demanding that it go where you want rather than where it naturally flows. But the river does not care about your plans. Life does not arrange itself according to your desire for certainty. The more you try to control, the more you suffer when things do not go as planned. They sat in silence for a while, the boat drifting gently, and Ichiro began to notice something he had never experienced before. The river was moving them exactly where they needed to go without any effort from Goro. The current was carrying them to places where fish were rising. The wind was helping rather than hindering. Everything was flowing, and all Goro was doing was paying attention and making small adjustments, working with what was actually happening rather than trying to force some predetermined plan. What about when things go wrong? Ichiro asked. What about when the unexpected happens? Surely then you wish you had planned better, controlled more. Goro pulled in his line. Check the bait, cast again. Things always go differently than expected. This is the nature of life. No amount of planning prevents change and uncertainty. But I have discovered something profound. I handle unexpected challenges better when I am present and responsive than when I am rigid and controlling. When I am flowing with the river, I can adjust quickly. When I am trying to force the river to go my way, I break when circumstances change. That afternoon, a sudden storm came up, something Ichiro would have spent days preparing for and worrying about. But Goro simply turned the boat and let the wind help them back to shore, using the very force that seemed like a problem as an assistance. They arrived safely, faster than they would have under normal conditions. You see, Goro said, as they secured the boat. The storm was not a problem to overcome through better planning. It was a force to work with, to flow with. Life is like this. When you stop trying to control everything and instead practice flowing with what is actually here, you discover a power and ease you could never achieve through force and control. Over the following months, Ichiro began practicing what Goro had taught him. He still made plans for his business, still prepared for contingencies, still acted responsibly. But he held his plans more lightly. When circumstances changed in unexpected ways, instead of panicking because things were not going according to plan, he would ask himself, how can I work with what is actually happening? How can I flow with this, rather than resist it? His business actually improved. He became more responsive to opportunities, more adaptable to changing conditions, more creative in solving problems that arose. And the constant anxiety that had plagued him for years began to ease because he was no longer trying to control the uncontrollable, no longer fighting against the natural flow of life. Sleep began to come more naturally. At night, when his mind would try to plan and prepare and control, he would practice what Goro had taught him. He would imagine himself as water flowing down a river, following the path of least resistance, trusting the current, working with what was here rather than trying to force what might be. One night, many months after that fishing trip, Ichiro was lying in bed when his mind began spinning into worry about a business deal that was uncertain, that might not go as planned. The old Ichiro would have spent hours trying to plan for every possible outcome, trying to control variables he could not actually control, exhausting himself with anxious thinking. But this Ichiro simply asked, "Am I flowing with what is actually here, or am I fighting against uncertainty that is the natural state of life?" And he felt himself relax, felt himself let go of the need to control, felt himself trust that he would respond skillfully to whatever actually happened when it actually happened. He fell asleep like a leaf floating on water, carried by currents larger than himself, trusting the flow, at peace with not knowing exactly where the river would take him. As you rest here now, can you practice what Ichiro learned? Can you let go of trying to control this moment? Control how you rest. Control the future. Can you flow with what is actually here, trusting that you will meet what comes when it comes? Life is a river. You can flow with it or fight against it. Rest now in the flow. Let the current carry you. Trust the water. Sleep like a leaf drifting downstream, effortless and at peace. Our 11th story takes us to a bustling city where merchants shouted their wares, where the streets were always crowded with people hurrying to somewhere else, where the noise and movement never seemed to stop, even at night. Here lived a scholar named Masako, who had dedicated her entire life to the study of Buddhist texts, to understanding the Dharma through rigorous intellectual inquiry. Masako's small apartment was filled with books, scrolls stacked to the ceiling, notes covering every surface. She could quote sutras from memory, explain complex philosophical concepts with precision, debate the finer points of doctrine with expertise that impressed even the most learned monks. Her knowledge was vast, encyclopedic, genuinely impressive by any measure. But Masako was deeply unhappy. The more she learned about peace, the less peace she felt. The more she studied enlightenment, the further enlightenment seemed. The more she understood intellectually about letting go, the tighter she gripped. And sleep had become nearly impossible because her mind never stopped analyzing, categorizing, conceptualizing, turning every experience into an object of study rather than something to be lived. She would lie awake at night thinking about what she had read that day, trying to integrate new teachings with old ones, trying to resolve contradictions between different texts, trying to understand her way to liberation through sheer mental effort. The irony was not lost on her. She was studying non-attachment while being completely attached to her studies, reading about being present while being completely lost in conceptual thinking. One evening, Masako attended a lecture by a Zen teacher named Soen, who was visiting the city. She went with her usual notebook, ready to take detailed notes, to capture every nuance of the teaching so she could study it later. But when Son began to speak, something unexpected happened. Soen did not lecture about Buddhism. He did not explain philosophical concepts. He did not reference texts or sutras. Instead, he simply rang a bell, a clear, pure sound that filled the hall and then slowly faded into silence. "Did you hear that?" Soen asked. Everyone nodded, confused about where this was going. Did you need to study the philosophy of sound to hear it? Did you need to understand the physics of vibration? Did you need to read texts about bells? People shook their heads. You simply heard it. Soen said, direct experience, immediate, before thinking, before concepts, before analysis, just hearing. This is enlightenment, direct experience of what is actually here, before the mind complicates it with thinking about it. He rang the bell again. When the bell rang the first time, you heard it directly. But now, are you hearing this second ring? Or are you thinking about it, comparing it to the first ring, analyzing what I am teaching? mentally preparing your questions. Masako realized with a shock that she was not actually hearing the second bell. She was thinking about the bell, about the teaching, about what questions she should ask. She had completely missed the direct experience because she was so busy conceptualizing it. After the talk, Masako approached Soan, her notebook filled with scribbled thoughts and questions. "Teacher," she said, "I have studied Buddhism extensively. I have read hundreds of texts, but I feel no closer to peace or enlightenment than when I began. What am I missing?" Soan looked at her notebook, at the books she was carrying, at the intensity in her eyes that spoke of someone trying very hard to understand their way to freedom. "You are trying to think your way to something that exists prior to thinking," he said gently. "You are studying the menu instead of eating the meal. You are analyzing maps instead of taking the journey." He gestured for her to sit. "Tell me, when you read about peace in a text, do you feel peace?" Masako shook her head. "No, I feel interested, engaged, sometimes confused, but not peaceful." "And when you study teachings about being present, are you present?" Again, she had to admit she was not. She was thinking about being present, but that very thinking took her out of presence. "This is what I want you to understand," Soan said with great compassion. "All these texts you study, all this knowledge you accumulate, these are fingers pointing at the moon. They point at direct experience, at presence, at the awakened state. But you have become so focused on studying the fingers, comparing them, analyzing them, trying to understand which finger is pointing most accurately, that you have forgotten to look at what they are pointing toward." Soan stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "For the next week, I want you to practice something radical. Stop studying. Put away your books, your notes, your texts. Instead, practice direct experience. When you eat, just eat, taste the food, feel the texture, notice the flavors, without thinking about Buddhist teachings on mindful eating. When you walk, just walk, feel your feet, notice your breath, be present to the movement without analyzing the experience or comparing it to what you have read." He turned back to her. "And when you lie down to sleep, do not think about what the sutras say about rest. Just lie there. Feel the bed beneath you. Notice your breathing. Be present to the simple direct experience of resting, without any conceptual overlay, without any intellectual understanding. Just the raw, immediate experience of what it feels like to be here, now, resting." Masako felt resistance rising. "But what about my studies? What about deepening my understanding?" "Your understanding has become an obstacle," Soan said gently but firmly. "You understand everything about peace intellectually, but you do not know peace directly. You can explain enlightenment with great sophistication, but you have not tasted it. For 1 week, let go of understanding, practice experiencing, see what happens." That week was one of the most challenging and transformative of Masako's life. Every time she reached for a book, she would stop herself. Every time her mind wanted to analyze an experience, she would gently return to direct perception. When she ate breakfast, instead of thinking about teachings on impermanence, she simply tasted her food. When she walked to the market, instead of analyzing her walking, she simply felt her feet touching the ground. At first, it felt terrifyingly empty. Without the constant mental activity of studying and analyzing, there was just this. Just the experience itself. No commentary, no framework, no understanding to hide behind. It felt naked, vulnerable, almost frightening. But gradually, something began to emerge. When she stopped thinking about peace and simply sat quietly, there was peace. Not as a concept, not as something she understood, but as a direct experience. A quality of stillness that arose when she stopped stirring the water with mental activity. When she stopped analyzing her experience and simply experienced, there was a freshness, an aliveness, a vividness that she had never noticed because she had always been too busy thinking about her experience to actually have it. And at night, when she lay down to sleep, she practiced what Soan had instructed. Instead of thinking about what the text said about rest, instead of analyzing her experience of lying in bed, she simply was here, feeling the sheets against her skin, noticing the rhythm of her breathing, being present to the direct, immediate, unmediated experience of resting. Sleep came more easily than it had in years, not because she had learned some new technique, not because she had understood something new, but because she had stopped interfering with the natural process with endless thinking and analyzing and conceptualizing. One night, near the end of the week, Masako was lying in bed when a profound shift happened. She was not thinking about being present. She was not analyzing her experience. She was not trying to understand anything. She was simply here, aware, present, and in that direct experience, without conceptual overlay, she touched something she had been reading about for years but had never actually experienced: peace. Not as an idea, not as something she understood intellectually, but as a direct felt experience. It was not dramatic or enlightening in the way her books had described. It was simple, quiet, ordinary, just the direct experience of being here, aware, at rest, without the constant mental commentary that usually overlaid every moment. The next morning, she went to find Soen before he left the city. When she approached him, he smiled, seeing immediately that something had shifted. "You stopped studying the finger and looked at the moon," he said. Masako bowed deeply, tears in her eyes. "I have spent years accumulating knowledge about direct experience, but I had never actually had direct experience because I was always thinking about it, analyzing it, trying to understand it. This week you gave me the greatest teaching, not more information, but permission to stop seeking information and simply be." Soen nodded. "Now you know the difference between the map and the territory, between the menu and the meal, between understanding peace and being peace. Your studies were not wasted, they brought you to this point of recognizing that something beyond study was needed. But now you can live from direct experience rather than from concepts about experience. As you rest here now, can you practice what Masako learned? Can you let go of thinking about rest and simply rest? Can you stop analyzing this experience and simply have it? No concepts, no understanding, no framework, just this, just breathing, just being. Direct experience, immediate and alive, prior to all thinking. This is where peace lives, not in understanding, but in simple direct presence." Our 12th story takes us to a temple garden where ancient trees cast shadows that moved like living paintings across the stone paths, where koi swam in ponds so still they reflected the sky like mirrors, where every element had been placed with such care that the whole space seemed to breathe with intentionality. Here lived a nun named Chio, who had been struggling with a question that tormented her sleep and disturbed her peace. Chio was a good person. She followed the precepts carefully. She was kind to others, generous with her time, dedicated to her practice, but she could not escape a crushing sense of guilt that seemed to permeate everything. Not guilt for specific terrible actions. She had not harmed anyone grievously, but a more diffuse, pervasive guilt for being imperfect, for having negative thoughts, for not being as compassionate or patient or wise as she believed a true practitioner should be. Every small irritation, every moment of impatience, every negative thought became evidence of her fundamental unworthiness. She would catch herself feeling annoyed at another nun's loud chewing and immediately spiral into shame. She would notice a judgmental thought about someone and condemn herself for being cruel. She would feel tired during meditation and berate herself for being lazy. The guilt was exhausting and relentless. It followed her into sleep, turning her dreams into courtrooms where she was always on trial, always found wanting, always condemned. She would wake feeling guilty for not sleeping well, creating a cycle that seemed to have no exit. One day, the abbess of the temple, a woman named Eshun who had practiced for 60 years and who carried a quality of profound self-acceptance, asked to speak with Chio privately. They sat together in the garden, and Eshun looked at Chio with eyes that saw everything: the exhaustion, the self-judgment, the crushing weight of impossible standards. "Tell me," Eshun said gently, "if you saw a small child learning to walk and the child fell down, would you shame the child? Would you tell the child they are fundamentally defective for not walking perfectly?" "Of course not," Chio said. "Falling is part of learning to walk. It is natural, expected, not something to feel guilty about." "And yet," Eshun continued, You are like a child learning to walk in the spiritual life. You are learning to be patient, to be compassionate, to be present. Of course you fall sometimes. Of course you have moments of irritation, judgmental thoughts, tiredness. This is not evidence of fundamental defectiveness. This is evidence that you are human, learning, growing, exactly where you need to be in your development. Chio felt tears beginning to form. But I should be better by now. I have been practicing for years. I should not still be having negative thoughts. Should not still be getting irritated. Should not still be struggling with basic things. Eshin smiled with infinite tenderness. Who told you there is a should? Who decided what timeline your growth should follow? You are comparing yourself to some imagined ideal of what a practitioner should be at your stage, and you are finding yourself lacking. But this ideal exists only in your mind. It is not real. It is not based on how growth actually works. She gestured to a young tree in the garden. This tree was planted 3 years ago. Should it be fully grown by now? Should it stop being a young tree and instantly become an ancient tree because time has passed? Or does it simply grow at the rate it grows, following its nature, becoming what it is meant to become in its own time? Eshun reached out and took Chio's hands. You are growing at exactly the rate you are meant to grow. Every moment of irritation that you notice and work with is practice. Every judgmental thought that you recognize and let go of is progress. Every time you fall and get back up, you are learning. This is not failure. This is the path itself. She paused, making sure Chio was really hearing this. The guilt you carry is not helping you grow. It is not making you a better person. It is not serving anyone. It is only creating suffering for you and indirectly for those around you who have to deal with your exhaustion and self-judgment. The Buddha taught that we should have the same compassion for ourselves that we have for others. But you are treating yourself with harshness you would never show another person. Over the following weeks, Chio practiced what Eshin had taught her. When she noticed herself having a negative thought or feeling impatient or struggling with practice, instead of immediately spiraling into guilt and self-condemnation, she would practice a different response. She would acknowledge what happened. I felt irritated just now. Then she would practice self-compassion. This is part of being human, part of learning, part of the path. I am doing my best. And finally, she would let it go, the way she might comfort a child who had fallen and help them get back up without shaming them for falling. At first, this practice felt strange, almost like she was letting herself off the hook too easily. Shouldn't she hold herself accountable? Shouldn't she be harder on herself to ensure she improved? But gradually she began to see that the harshness had never helped. The guilt had never made her more patient or compassionate. If anything, it had made her more self-focused, more anxious, less able to be present to others because she was so consumed with monitoring and judging herself. With self-compassion, something different happened. When she met her imperfections with kindness rather than condemnation, she actually learned from them more effectively. When she noticed irritation and responded with, "This is part of being human," rather than, "I am a terrible person," she could see the irritation more clearly, understand its causes, work with it skillfully, and sleep began to return. At night, when memories of the day's imperfections would arise the moment she was impatient, the judgmental thought she had, the time she was less than perfectly present, she practiced the same self-compassion. I am learning. I am growing. I am human. This is the path. The guilt that had kept her awake for so long began to dissolve like morning mist in sunlight. She could rest in the recognition that she was doing her best, that growth takes time, that she deserved the same compassion she would offer anyone else struggling with the same challenges. One night, several months after her conversation with Eshun, Chio was lying in bed when she noticed a familiar judgmental thought arising about another nun. The old Chio would have immediately felt crushing guilt for having this thought, would have spent hours condemning herself, would have turned a passing thought into evidence of fundamental unworthiness. But this Chio simply noticed the thought with gentle awareness. A judgmental thought arose. This is normal. This is part of being human. I can let it go. And she did. No drama, no guilt, no spiral into self-condemnation. Just a thought arising and passing, like a cloud moving through the sky. She fell asleep, held by self-compassion, by the recognition that she was exactly where she needed to be, learning at exactly the rate she needed to learn, worthy of kindness and rest and peace, regardless of her imperfections. The next morning, she found Eshun in the garden and simply bowed deeply. "Thank you, teacher," she said. "You showed me that the guilt was not helping me grow, that I could meet myself with the same compassion I would offer a child learning to walk, that I am allowed to be human, to be learning, to be imperfect." Eshun smiled with warmth. "Now you know something precious. You cannot hate yourself into becoming a better person. You can only love yourself into wholeness. The Buddha's compassion includes you. You are not exempt from the kindness you offer others. As you rest here now, can you practice what Chio learned? Can you let go of guilt for being imperfect, for having negative thoughts, for not being as far along as you think you should be? You are learning. You are growing. You are exactly where you need to be. Meet yourself with compassion. Forgive yourself for being human. Let yourself rest in kindness rather than condemnation." Our 13th story takes us to a village where bamboo forests surrounded the homes like protective walls, where the sound of wind through bamboo was a constant gentle music, where people lived simply and close to the earth. Here lived a farmer named Jiro, who had experienced a loss so devastating that he believed he would never recover, that peace would never return, that sleep would always elude him. 3 years earlier, Jiro's wife had died suddenly, leaving him alone with their 2 young children. The grief had been overwhelming, crushing, a pain so intense that some days he could barely breathe through it. But over time, with the help of his community and the demands of caring for his children, he had learned to function, to continue with daily life, to find moments of okayness amid the sorrow. But he could not forgive himself for moving on. When he found himself laughing at something, one of his children said, guilt would immediately follow. How could he laugh when his wife was gone? When he noticed the grief was not as sharp as it had been, when whole hours would pass without thinking of her, he would feel like he was betraying her memory, abandoning her, being disloyal to their love. This guilt kept him awake night after night. He would lie in the darkness thinking about his wife, forcing himself to remember, refusing to let the natural healing that time brings do its work, because he believed that healing meant forgetting, that peace meant he had not loved deeply enough, that moving forward meant leaving her behind. One day, a Buddhist nun named Ryanan came to the village. She was very old, her face deeply lined, her movements slow but graceful. Jiro's neighbor mentioned that Ryanan had experienced many losses in her long life, had outlived children and siblings and dear friends, yet she carried a quality of peace that seemed to embrace sorrow without being destroyed by it. Jiro sought her out, not quite knowing what he hoped to find, but desperate for some relief from the guilt that was consuming him. They met in a quiet grove of bamboo, and Jiro poured out his struggle, how he could not forgive himself for healing, for moving forward, for sometimes feeling okay despite his devastating loss. Ryanan listened with complete presence, her ancient eyes holding such compassion that Jiro felt safe enough to reveal his deepest fear. "I am terrified that if I let myself heal completely, if I allow myself to be at peace, it means I did not love her enough. That my love was shallow if I can recover from losing her. That moving forward is a betrayal of everything we shared." Ryanan was quiet for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but clear. "Tell me, when your wife was alive, did she want you to be happy?" "Of course," Jiro said. "She wanted nothing more than for me and our children to be happy. And if she were here now, if she could speak to you, would she want you to torture yourself with guilt for finding moments of joy? Would she want you to refuse healing because you believe it honors her memory? Would she want you sleepless and suffering as proof of your love?" Jiro felt tears streaming down his face. "No, she would want me to heal. She would want me to be okay. She would want me to laugh with our children, to find peace, to live fully even without her." Then, Ryanan said softly, "Who does your suffering serve? It does not serve her. She is beyond being helped or hurt by what you do now. It does not serve your children. They need a father who can be present, who can model that it is possible to survive devastating loss and still embrace life. It does not serve you. You are destroying yourself with guilt that helps no one. Who does this suffering serve? Jiro realized with shocking clarity that his suffering served no one. It was not keeping his wife's memory alive. The guilt was actually preventing him from remembering her clearly, because every memory was tangled up with shame about moving forward. It was not honoring their love. Their love had been about joy and connection and life, not about endless suffering. True love, Rhiannon continued, does not demand that you remain broken. True love wants healing for the beloved. If you truly love her, honor that love by allowing yourself to heal, by embracing the life that remains, by finding joy again. This is not betrayal. This is the deepest honoring of what you shared. You learned from her how to love life, and now you continue to love life, even though she is not here to share it. She reached out and placed a weathered hand on Jiro's. Grief and peace can coexist. You can miss her terribly and also laugh with your children. You can carry her memory tenderly and also sleep peacefully. You can honor what you lost and also embrace what remains. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means integrating loss into your life in a way that allows you to continue living fully. Rhiannon stood slowly, her joints creaking. The Buddha taught about impermanence, that all things change, all things pass, nothing remains the same. This includes grief. Grief that is sharp and all-consuming naturally softens with time if we allow it. This is not wrong. This is not betrayal. This is how healing works. Your grief will never disappear completely. You loved deeply, and that love leaves a permanent mark. But the grief can become something you carry gently, rather than something that destroys you. Over the following months, Jiro practiced allowing healing to happen. When he found himself laughing and guilt arose, he would remember Rhiannon's question, "Who does this suffering serve?" And he would allow the laughter, would let himself feel joy, knowing that his wife would want this for him. When he realized whole days had passed without the sharp pain of grief, instead of forcing himself to suffer to prove his love, he would simply feel gratitude that healing was possible, that life continued, that he could honor what he had lost while also embracing what remained. And at night, when he lay down to sleep, he would practice what she had taught him. When memories of his wife arose, which they still did, often he would hold them tenderly without guilt. He could miss her and also rest. He could remember their love and also allow his body the peace it needed. These things could coexist. Sleep began to return. Not every night without any pain, not perfectly or completely, but more often, more deeply. He could rest in the recognition that healing was not betrayal, that moving forward was not abandonment, that he could carry his love for her into the future while also fully living the life that remained. One night, about a year after meeting Rhiannon, Jiro had a dream. His wife appeared to him, smiling, radiant, whole. In the dream, she spoke to him. "I am so glad you are healing. I am so glad you are laughing with our children. I am so glad you are learning to sleep again." This is not betrayal. This is exactly what love would want for life to continue, for joy to return, for you to be okay. He woke with tears on his face, but they were different tears now, not tears of guilt, but tears of gratitude, of release, of finally giving himself permission to honor her memory by living fully rather than by suffering endlessly. As you rest here now, is there a loss you carry that you believe you are not allowed to heal from? Can you practice what Jiro learned? Healing is not betrayal. Peace does not mean you loved less deeply. You can honor what you lost and also embrace what remains. Grief and peace can coexist. You can remember and also rest. Let yourself heal. Those you have lost would want this for you. Our 14th story takes us to a monastery where winter winds howled around ancient stone walls, where the cold was so intense that ice would form inside the meditation hall, where monks practiced with a dedication that seemed to defy the harsh conditions. Here lived a young monk named Kenzo, who had come to the monastery running from himself, from a past he could not accept, from shame so deep it felt like it would never heal. Before becoming a monk, Kenzo had been involved in activities that harmed others. He had lied, stolen, betrayed trust in ways that still made him sick to remember. When the consequences caught up with him, when he saw clearly the damage he had caused, the remorse was so overwhelming that he felt his only option was complete transformation, to leave everything behind and dedicate himself to a spiritual path, to somehow make amends, through becoming a better person. But 5 years into monastic life, the shame had not diminished. If anything, it had grown sharper. He would sit in meditation, and memories would assault him, the people he had hurt, the trust he had betrayed, the version of himself he could barely recognize but could not escape. How could someone like him ever be worthy of peace? How could someone who had caused such harm deserve rest, or happiness, or liberation? The other monks did not know his past. They saw only his dedication, his strict practice, his apparent discipline. But Kenzo knew the truth. He was not practicing from authentic spiritual aspiration, but from desperate self-punishment. From a belief that if he could just be good enough, disciplined enough, perfect enough, maybe he could somehow erase what he had done, make himself worthy of forgiveness. Sleep was nearly impossible. When he lay down, the memories would come like demons, vivid and accusing. He would see the faces of people he had hurt, hear the echoes of lies he had told, feel again the emptiness of the person he had been. He would lie awake for hours, sometimes all night, locked in mental courtrooms where he was both prosecutor and defendant, always finding himself guilty, always condemning himself to suffer. The abbot of the monastery was an ancient monk named Dido, who had lived through war, personal tragedy, and his own youthful mistakes. He had watched Kenzo for years, seeing the rigid self-punishment masquerading as dedication, recognizing the pattern of someone running from themselves rather than toward liberation. One winter morning, after Kenzo had spent another sleepless night, Dido called him to his quarters. When Kenzo arrived, exhausted and hollow-eyed, Dido was sitting by a small fire, the only warmth in the frozen monastery. "Sit," Dido said, gesturing to the space across from him. Kenzo sat, expecting perhaps a teaching on meditation or a correction of his practice, but instead, Dido said something that stopped his breath. "Tell me about what you did before you came here. Tell me about the harm you caused." Kenzo felt panic rising. His secret, the shame he had hidden for 5 years, was somehow known. He wanted to flee, to deny, to protect himself from the exposure he had dreaded. But Dido's eyes held such compassion, such absence of judgment, that Kenzo found himself speaking. He told everything: the lies, the betrayals, the people he had hurt through his selfishness and greed. He confessed to actions he had never spoken aloud, shame he had carried alone for years. The words came in a flood, and with them came tears, years of held grief and self-condemnation pouring out in Dido's small, warm room. When Kenzo finally finished, exhausted and trembling, he waited for judgment, for condemnation, for confirmation that he was as irredeemable as he believed. But Dido simply nodded and asked a question. Who was the person who did those things? Kenzo was confused. "It was me. I did those things." "No," Dido said gently but firmly. "I asked who was the person who did those things. Describe that person to me. What did they believe? What did they understand? What was their state of mind?" Kenzo thought back to who he had been 5 years ago. "I was lost, confused, acting from greed and fear. I did not understand the consequences of my actions. I was so caught up in my own desires that I could not see how I was harming others. I was asleep, in a way, unconscious. And is that person sitting here with me now?" Kenzo paused, really considering this question. The person he had been operating from that level of confusion and unconsciousness was not the person sitting here. He had transformed profoundly. His understanding had deepened. His capacity for empathy had developed. His awareness had expanded. He was literally not the same person who had committed those actions. "No," Kenzo said slowly. "That person. I'm not that person anymore." Dido leaned forward. "Every cell in your body has been replaced since those actions occurred. Your understanding has transformed completely. Your consciousness has evolved beyond recognition. You are literally not the same person who did those things. That person was doing the best they could with the understanding they had, acting from confusion and suffering. But that person no longer exists." He paused, letting this truth settle. "What exists now is you, someone who has genuine remorse, who has transformed completely, who has dedicated 5 years to becoming a different person. And yet you continue to identify with that past person, to take on their guilt as if those actions were happening now, as if you are still that confused, unconscious person making those harmful choices. Daido stood and placed another log on the fire. The Buddha taught about anatta non-self, the recognition that what we call self is not a fixed, permanent entity but a constantly changing process. You cling to the idea of a permanent self who did those things and must forever be defined by them. But this is not reality. There is no permanent self. There is only this ever-changing process of consciousness, and the consciousness that is here now is profoundly different from the consciousness that committed those actions. Kenzo felt something beginning to shift, like tectonic plates moving deep underground. But the people I hurt, they still carry the consequences of what I did. Does my transformation erase that? No, Daido said with complete honesty. The consequences are real. The harm was real. Nothing erases that. But your continued self-punishment does not help them. Your refusal to forgive yourself does not undo what was done. All it does is ensure there is one more person suffering in the world. He returned to his seat. True responsibility for past harm is not endless self-hatred. It is honest acknowledgement which you have done. It is genuine remorse which you clearly feel. It is making amends where possible and where it would be helpful rather than harmful. And most importantly, it is transformation, becoming a completely different person who would never commit those actions again, who operates from wisdom rather than confusion, who contributes healing rather than harm to the world. Daido looked at Kenzo with eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. You have done all of this. You have transformed completely. You have become a different person. The only thing you have not done is forgive yourself. Release the past. Allow healing to complete itself. And this unwillingness to forgive yourself is not virtue. It is not loyalty to those you harmed. It is attachment to suffering, attachment to an identity as someone fundamentally bad, attachment to guilt as a way of feeling like you are paying for what you did. Over the following months, Kenzo practiced what Daido had taught him. When memories of his past actions arose, which they still did regularly, he practiced a new response. He would acknowledge, yes, those actions happened. They were real. They caused harm. Then he would remind himself, but the person who did those things was operating from confusion I no longer have. I have transformed completely. I am not that person anymore. He would practice self-compassion, recognizing that he had been doing the best he could with the understanding he had at that time. He would acknowledge his transformation as real and complete, and he would practice forgiveness not as a way of saying what he did was acceptable, but as a way of releasing himself from a prison that served no one. At night, when the memories would come and try to keep him awake with shame and guilt, he would practice what Daido had taught him. That person no longer exists. I have transformed. I deserve compassion for being lost and finding my way. I can rest now. Sleep began to return. Not perfectly, not without difficult nights, but more often, more deeply. He could rest in the recognition that he was not his past, that transformation was real, that he could honor the seriousness of what he had done while also allowing himself to move forward as a completely different person. One night, almost a year after his conversation with Daido, Kenzo was lying in bed when a particularly painful memory arose, one of the worst things he had done, something that had haunted him for years. But this time, instead of the familiar cascade of shame and self-hatred, he felt something entirely different. He felt compassion. Compassion for the confused, suffering person he had been, acting from such deep unconsciousness. Compassion for the people he had hurt, who had their own journeys of healing to walk. Compassion for everyone involved in that situation, all of them doing their best, all of them suffering, all of them human and flawed and deserving of forgiveness. And in that moment of compassion, the memory lost its power to torture him. It became simply something that had happened, a fact of his history, evidence of how far he had traveled from unconsciousness toward awareness. He fell asleep held by compassion, resting in the recognition that he was worthy of peace, not despite his past, but including his past. All of it part of the journey that had brought him here. As you rest here now, is there something from your past that you have been unable to forgive yourself for? Can you practice what Kenzo learned? The person who did that was doing the best they could with the understanding they had. You have transformed since then. You are not that person anymore. You can acknowledge what happened, feel genuine remorse, and also release yourself from endless punishment. Forgive yourself. You deserve compassion. You deserve rest. Let yourself sleep in peace. Our 15th story takes us to a village at the edge of a great desert, where sand dunes stretched to the horizon like frozen waves, where the heat during the day was intense and the cold at night was bitter, where people lived in the space between extremes. Here lived a merchant named Saburo, who had built a life of material comfort through shrewd business dealings and careful accumulation. Saburo had a successful trade business. He had a comfortable home. He had wealth enough to live well and provide for his family. By most measures, he should have been content. But Saburo was consumed by one thing that kept him from peace, from satisfaction, from rest: comparison. He could not stop comparing himself to others. When he saw a merchant with a larger shop, he felt inadequate. When he heard of someone making a more profitable deal, he felt like a failure. When he noticed someone with a bigger home or finer clothes or more prestige, the envy would gnaw at him, making his own considerable success feel worthless. No achievement brought lasting satisfaction because there was always someone doing better, achieving more, having something he did not have. He was trapped on a hedonic treadmill, where every accomplishment only revealed new inadequacies, where every gain only highlighted what he had not yet gained. Sleep became difficult because his mind would spin with comparisons, replaying business deals others had made that he had missed, imagining the success of competitors, measuring himself against others, and always finding himself lacking. The constant comparison was exhausting, but he could not seem to stop. One day, a Buddhist teacher named Genjo came to the village, and Saburo attended one of his talks, hoping perhaps to find some technique for achieving more, for finally getting ahead of his competitors, for reaching a level of success where comparison would no longer torment him. But Genjo did not speak about achievement or success. Instead, he told a simple story. A fish was swimming in the ocean when another fish passed by and said, "How is the water today?" The first fish, confused, replied, "What water?" The fish had spent its entire life in water, but had never noticed water because it was so completely immersed in it that it had become invisible. Genjo paused, letting the story settle. You are like that fish. You are swimming in an ocean of blessings, but you have become so focused on looking at what others have that you cannot see what you yourself are immersed in. Your life is filled with gifts, health, family, success, comfort, but these have become invisible to you because you are constantly comparing them to what others have. After the talk, Saburo approached Genjo, feeling both defensive and curious. But surely it is natural to want to improve, to achieve more, to not settle for less than what is possible. Should I not strive to be as successful as others? Genjo smiled gently. There is a difference between healthy aspiration and the suffering of comparison. Healthy aspiration says, I would like to grow, to develop new skills, to create value. It is directed toward your own potential, your own path. But comparison says, I am not enough because someone else has more. It is directed outward, toward others, and it creates suffering because there will always be someone with more, always someone achieving greater things, always someone to feel inadequate compared to. He gestured for Saburo to walk with him through the village. The Buddha taught about gratitude as an antidote to suffering. When you practice gratitude for what you actually have rather than fixating on what others have or what you lack, something profound shifts. Not because your circumstances change, but because your relationship to your circumstances changes. They stopped at a well where villagers were drawing water. Look at this well, Genjo said. It provides clean water for the entire village. Someone who focuses only on what they lack might say, this well is not as large as the well in the next village, not as beautifully decorated, not as deep. But someone practicing gratitude would say, this well provides everything we need. How fortunate we are to have clean water. He looked at Saburo directly. You have a successful business that provides for you and your family. You have health. You have a home. You have food. These are not small things. These are profound blessings that much of humanity would consider extraordinary wealth. but you cannot see them because you are looking at what others have instead of at what you have. Genjo continued walking. Here is what I want you to practice. Each evening before sleep, instead of comparing yourself to others, instead of measuring your success against theirs, practice gratitude. Name 3 specific things from your day that you are grateful for. Not general things, not what you think you should be grateful for, but actual specific moments or circumstances that brought you some benefit, some ease, some joy. Over the following weeks, Saburo began this practice, and at first it felt forced, artificial, like he was trying to convince himself to feel something he did not feel. His mind would immediately jump to comparisons. Yes, he was grateful for his home, but that other merchant's home was larger. Yes, he was grateful for his business, but he was not as successful as his competitor. But Genjo had anticipated this. When comparison arises, he had instructed, simply notice it and return to gratitude. It is like meditation. The mind wanders, you notice, you return. The comparison will arise. Just come back to what you actually have, to the specific blessings of your actual life. Gradually, something began to shift. As Saburo practiced naming specific things he was grateful for each evening, he began to actually see his life more clearly. He noticed the taste of his evening meal, prepared with care by his wife. He appreciated the sound of his children playing, healthy and happy. He felt genuine gratitude for customers who trusted him, for his health that allowed him to work, for small kindnesses from neighbors. The ocean he had been swimming in without seeing it began to become visible. His life was not lacking, it was full. Not as full as some people's lives in some ways, but genuinely full in its own way. The comparison that had tormented him began to lose its power as he practiced seeing what was actually here rather than what was missing, and sleep began to come more easily. At night, instead of his mind spinning with comparisons and inadequacies, he would practice gratitude. 3 things from today: the morning sunlight through his window, a successful transaction that went smoothly, his daughter's laughter at dinner, specific, real blessings from his actual life. One night, several months into this practice, Saburo was lying in bed when he heard news that his main competitor had secured a contract he had wanted badly, a deal that would have significantly increased his business. The old Saburo would have spent all night in anguish, comparing, feeling inadequate, tormented by what he had not achieved. But this Saburo paused and practiced what Genjo had taught him. Instead of focusing on what he had not gotten, he brought to mind what he did have. His business was stable and provided well for his family. He had good relationships with his existing customers. He had freedom and health and time with his children, and he realized something profound. His competitor getting that contract did not actually diminish anything in his own life. He still had everything he had before. Nothing had been taken from him. The only loss was in his mind, in the story about what that contract would have meant, in the comparison that said someone else's gain was his loss. He fell asleep that night in peace, held by gratitude rather than tortured by comparison, resting in the fullness of his actual life rather than the imagined inadequacy created by looking at others' lives. The next morning, he sought out Genjo before the teacher left the village. "You have given me something more valuable than any business deal," Saburo said with genuine emotion. "You showed me that I was starving in the midst of abundance, suffering in the midst of blessings, because I could not see what I had, only what others had. Gratitude has freed me from the prison of comparison." Genjo bowed. "Now you know the secret the Buddha taught. Suffering does not come from what you have or do not have. It comes from the mind's relationship to what is. When you practice gratitude, when you see clearly the blessings that are actually here, rather than fixating on what is not here or what others have, peace becomes possible regardless of your circumstances. As you rest here now, can you practice what Saburo learned? Can you let go of comparison to others, of measuring yourself against imagined standards? Can you practice gratitude for what you actually have, this breath, this moment, this body that carries you through life? You are swimming in an ocean of blessings. Let yourself see them. Let yourself feel grateful. Let comparison dissolve and rest in the fullness of what is actually here. Our 16th story takes us to the final monastery on this long night's journey, where all the previous teachings come together, where the gentle path of these stories leads us home, here, in a temple that overlooks a valley where morning mist gathers like clouds fallen to earth. All the monks and nuns from our stories have gathered for one final teaching. Ren is here, the one who learned to stop trying and allow enlightenment to reveal itself naturally, like leaves falling from trees. Hana is present, the tea house owner who discovered beauty in imperfection through kintsugi and wabi-sabi. Koji sits quietly, the monk who learned that guilt kept fresh through memory serves no one, that the ice heals and new snow falls. Keiko has come, the weaver who released worry about the future and learned to rest in the okayness of the present moment. Midori is here, the nun who discovered she was the sky holding all thoughts like clouds, not the thoughts themselves. Fumiko has joined them, the potter who found warmth in imperfection, who let go of cold perfection for living, breathing, human beauty. Tetsuya sits among them, freed from rigid rules and resting in genuine presence. Ichiro is present, the merchant who learned to flow with life's river rather than trying to control its current. Masako has come, the scholar who stopped studying the menu and began eating the meal of direct experience. Chio rests here, released from crushing guilt and held by self-compassion. Jiro has arrived, the farmer who learned that healing from loss is not betrayal, but the deepest honoring of love. Kenzo sits peacefully, no longer imprisoned by a past that no longer defines him. And Saburo is present, his eyes finally able to see the ocean of blessings he swims in, rather than what others possess. They gather in the meditation hall as evening falls, and an ancient teacher, whose name has been forgotten by time, but whose presence holds all wisdom, speaks to them in a voice like wind through pine trees. You have each learned something essential on your journey. You have each discovered a truth that sets you free. But beneath all these different teachings, beneath all these varied stories, there is one understanding that connects them all, one recognition that is the heart of everything. The ancient teacher pauses, and in the silence the sound of wind chimes drifts through the open windows, pure and clear. You are already home. You have always been home. Everything you sought, through effort and discipline and understanding, through transformation and healing and growth, was already here, already present, already what you are, not as something to achieve but as something to recognize, not as somewhere to arrive but as where you already are. The ancient teacher's voice continues, soft as falling snow. Ren learned to stop seeking, but the seeking itself was the only obstacle. What he sought was never absent. Hana learned to accept imperfection, but perfection was always an illusion. The imperfect was always the real, always the beautiful. Koji learned to forgive himself, but the self that needed forgiving was a ghost, a story, never truly separate from the wholeness that is always here. Keiko discovered the present moment, but there has never been anything other than the present moment. The future she worried about never existed, except as thought. Midori recognized she was awareness, but she had never been anything other than awareness. The confusion was only in the identification with what awareness witnessed. Fumiko released perfectionism, but what she released was only an idea, only a belief, only a story about how things should be. What remained was the simple truth of what actually is. Tetsuya let go of rigid rules, but the freedom he found had always been available. The rules had only obscured what was already free. The ancient teacher stands and walks to the window where the last light of day is fading into darkness. Each of you learned to release something seeking, perfectionism, guilt, worry, comparison. But what you actually discovered was not a new state you achieved, but the recognition of what was always here, beneath all the seeking, beneath all the striving, beneath all the stories you told about who you were and what you needed. The teacher turns back to face them, and in the gathering darkness their form seems to dissolve, becoming less a person and more a presence, more a quality of awareness itself speaking. This is what the Buddha taught when he spoke of enlightenment. Not a state to achieve, but a recognition of what you already are. Not something to become, but something to remember. Not a destination to reach, but a reality to notice that was always here, always present, always home. And tonight, as you rest, as you release into sleep, you can practice this ultimate recognition. You are not your thoughts, you are the awareness that knows thoughts. You are not your emotions, you are the space in which emotions arise and pass. You are not your body, you are the consciousness that experiences the body. You are not separate from anything. You are the wholeness experiencing itself as this temporary individual form. The ancient teacher's voice becomes quieter, more intimate, as if speaking directly into each person's heart. Let yourself dissolve now. Not as a practice, not as something to achieve, but simply as a allowing of what naturally happens when you stop holding yourself together through effort and identification and story. Feel how your body is already dissolving into the darkness, how the boundary between you and the space around you is softening, becoming permeable, easier to release. Where do you end and the darkness begin? The separation was always an illusion. You are the darkness and what lies within it. You are the space and what appears in space. You are everything. Your breath is slowing, becoming so subtle now that you can barely feel its movement. The rhythm that has carried you through this entire journey is releasing you into stillness, into the vast ocean of rest that has no beginning and no end. Breathing in, breathing out, and then just being. Not even breathing, just the pure presence that witnesses breath and is unchanged by breath. All the teachings you have heard tonight are dissolving like sugar in water, sweetening everything but losing their separate forms. You do not need to remember them. They are part of you now, woven into your being, available whenever you need them, without effort or trying. The striving has ended. The seeking is complete. The journey has brought you here, to this moment, to this breath, to this simple recognition. You are already home. You have always been home. There is nowhere else to go, nothing else to become, nothing else to achieve. Rest now in this recognition. Rest in the awareness that you are. Rest in the peace that is your true nature. Rest in the wholeness that has never been broken. Rest in the home you have never left. The ancient teacher's voice fades to barely a whisper, and then to silence. And in that silence, everything is present. Everything is complete. Everything is exactly as it needs to be. And you, lying here in the darkness, breathing so softly now, you are held by this same silence, this same presence, this same wholeness. Nothing is asked of you. Nothing is demanded. You can simply be, simply rest, simply allow yourself to dissolve into the vast peace that holds all things. Your eyes are closed. Your body is heavy, so completely relaxed that it feels like you are sinking into whatever supports you, merging with it, becoming one with it. There is no effort left, no tension, no holding, just release, just letting go, just allowing. The stories are complete. The teachings are given. The journey is finished. All that remains is this moment, this breath, this gentle descent into the deepest rest you have known in so very long. May you sleep deeply tonight, held by the wisdom of these ancient teachings. May you wake tomorrow carrying something wordless but transformative. May you remember, even if only for a moment, that you are already home. May all beings rest in peace. May all beings know their true nature. May all beings be free from suffering. And may you, dear one, rest now in the recognition that you are loved, you are whole, you are enough exactly as you are. Sleep now. Rest. Peace. You are home. You have always been home. Sleep. Just sleep. Rest.